I am Almir Lima Nascimento, Director of the International Relations Research Institute of the Alexandre de Guzmão Foundation, FUNAG. It is truly an honor to be the master of ceremony on the second day of the Inception Conference. The virtual format of our conference enables the participation of professionals and researchers from all parts of the globe, and we are very optimistic and confident to try to meet our audience expectations. Before we delve into the rich content lined up for today, I seize the opportunity to extend our heartfelt gratitude to all persons who made this Inception Conference a reality, especially all the 6 task forces lead co-chairs and members, the leaders and staff of the organizing committee, 3 institutions, and most of all, the public that join us today. We are thrilled to have you with us. Throughout this Brazilian morning, the lead co-chairs of Task Force 4, Trade and Investment for Sustainable and Inclusive Growth, and Task Force 3, Reforming the International Financial Architecture, will present the main objectives and subtopics of their respective task forces with the assistance of the various co-chairs. We encourage you to actively participate in the discussions, ask questions, and share your insights. The second day T20 Brasil Inception Conference program is structured in 2 sessions, one before and the other after a few minutes break. At the beginning of the first session, Ambassador Márcia Loureiro, President of the Alexandre de Guzmão Foundation, will present her opening remarks. The second part begins with Dr. Vera Torstensen, Professor at the São Paulo School of Economics of the Getúlio Vargas Foundation and lead co-chair of Task Force 4, walking us through the main objectives of Task Force 4 and acting as moderator of the discussions with the 6 co-chairs that will respectively speak about each subtopic of the task force. Dr. Torstensen also moderates the 10-minute Q&A session. Then we move to the third part of this first morning section with the presentation of Dr. Ana Sajoro Garcia, Associate Researcher at the BRICS Policy Center, Brazil. The dynamic will be the same. Dr. Garcia will walk us through Task Force 3 main features and objectives, not only before moderating the discussions with the co-chairs of each subtopic of Task Force 3, but also before conducting the 10 minutes Q&A. Before closing this first morning session, Ambassador Marcos Caramurua, member of the SEBRE Advisory Board, will interview Ambassador Tatiana Rosito, coordinator of the finance track of the current G20 administration and Secretary of International Affairs at the Ministry of Finance. Alas, the tight schedule ahead of us will prevent our audience from having a Q&A with Ambassador Tatiana Rosito. In the sequence, we'll have a 10-minute break before commencing the second morning session of this Inception Conference. Returning from the break, the T20 Brasil Advisory Council's Secretariat panel will occur. As you know, in T20 Brazil, we have a national and an international advisory council. Dr. Ana Célia Castro, director of the Brazilian College of Advanced Studies at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, will present her remarks and be the moderator of this panel, in which each national and international council secretariat panelist will expose their views. In the sequence, Dr. Castro will be the moderator of the 25-minute reserved for comments and Q&A. The moderator will encourage other advisory council members to make commentaries and then open the floor to the audience. All can use at this moment the raise hand function of Zoom to indicate their interest in asking questions or commenting on the panel. Well, this is the strategy devised for the second day of T20 Brasil Inception Conference. But before starting our activities, there are a few housekeeping notes. Please ensure that your name and institutions are correctly displayed in the Zoom. Please ensure microphones are muted during the sessions to minimize background noise. Use the chat function to engage with fellow attendees, share resources, and ask questions. Questions that could not be addressed due to the limited time will be answered by email in the following days. This event is being recorded and live streamed on the T20 YouTube channel. And at last, our support team is ready to help in case you have a technical issue. Please use the chat to let us know. And now, let's dive into the T20 Brasil Inception Conference with the opening remarks of Ambassador Márcio Loureiro, President of FUNAG. Ambassador Loureiro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Almir. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second day of our conference. Yesterday, we had a very constructive dialogue that began with Task Forces 1 and 6. And one thing that caught my attention was the convergence about what constitutes a good recommendation, a strong recommendation. Participants mentioned relevance, precision, scale, feasibility. They also mentioned consideration of a country's capabilities, all those as aspects that affect the quality of a recommendation and therefore affect its impact. So I think that if we keep these criteria in mind, if we stick to them, we do have the potential to really influence the G20 official processes. We have a real opportunity considering that from the outset of the Brazilian presidency, representatives of both official tracks have reiterated that they want to increase the interaction with the engagement groups, that they want to invite society into the room, so to speak. And actually, that's a guideline at the highest level. President Lula himself said last November that society must be seen as an ally. So let's not miss the chance to be heard and hopefully to make a difference. Still speaking of government-society interaction, today we have as our guest the coordinator of the finance track. And it would be great to hear Ambassador Tatiana Rosito about the series of structured conversations with civil society that the Ministry of Finance is organizing. I understand it's an innovation of the Brazilian presidency, and if so, it's a very welcome innovation, considering that the finance track is historically seen as less open to the dialogue with society. So this seems to be a very positive development. But first, let's hear Task Forces 3 and 4, or rather 4 and 3, on the priorities that they have identified and selected, and their goals for the next months in these two key areas of interest for G20, actually areas that are in the foundations of G20, which are international trade and the international financial architecture. Thank you very much, and back to you, Almir.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Loureiro. You underscored very important aspects such as the good recommendations features and also about the dialogue between government and social society as a feature of the Brazilian G20 presidency. Without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Vera Torstensen, lead co-chair of Task Force 4, Trade and Investment for Sustainable and Inclusive Growth, to present the task force and moderate the following discussion. Uh, Dr. Torstensen, the floor is yours.
Are you listen to me? Okay.
Yes, we do.
Wow, finally. Now,
Yes.
good morning to everybody. Let's jump to the real business. First thing to do is to change our minds to discuss trade and investment. Let me give you the framework of our discussion. First point, we have to be clear. You have to have in mind that world is facing not a just crisis time; it's a disruptive time. We are seeing wars, hunger, poverty, maritime blockades, climate disaster, digital revolution, and the crisis of multilateralism. What happened in Abu Dhabi? Nothing. It's just a sick organization surviving. Point two of our framework. Forget about trade as a development instrument. Trade is being used for geoeconomics instruments. We have new tariffs on security because of security reason, on steel and everything. Race for subsidies. A developing country has no subsidies to go to this war. What else? Technical barriers for all. A war in standards. Then you have rules of origin, constructing blocks, and sanctions on intellectual property, how we are going to trade. The third point is about investment rules. We, for years, defend globalization, but now globalization is down. Trading blocks is up. We are seeing financial sanctions. And what's going on? Sanctions are not working because the market, the world invent new instruments, unregulated market. And what you have on investments, there is no international institution taking care of it, but you have a multiplication of bilaterals, minilaterals, all kind of agreements going on. The fourth point is you have, again, for people of trade, the old trade-related instruments. They are old and nothing happened to regulate them. You have environment barriers. Let me give you numbers. Do you know how many environment measures are notified and in the WTO? I tell you, 18,000. 18,000. Do you know how many voluntary standards? 500. Do you know how standards on accounting on ESGs? 500. I love these numbers to give to you. This is what I call trade wars on standards. We have the digital world. We talk about inclusion, but what we are seeing, a network of exclusion, ships war, a digital war. Now, and we need to go to the fifth point is who is ruling trade and investment? WTO? Well, not yet. Not well. The question for you, professors, neoliberalism is dead. What is the rules? What's going on? What is the new industrial policy? Should the WTO accept this and discuss this? Now, and I finish. What is the role of G20? As we listened yesterday, our Sherpa say, we need new ideas. Please, so forget about the old structure, about the old rules, and let's talk new issues again. Rules again, new rules. Now, our task force received 17 60, 70 abstracts. We are really taking care of them. We are anxious to have them, the papers already. And so let me jump to the co-chairs. I will invert the order. I'll start with topic 5, and we have a very special person to speak to us. That is Professor Michel Raton from Getúlio Vargas, and the group is composed by Sait Akman from Turkey and Xingquantu from China. Please, Michel, you have the floor. Who has Michel?
Yes, they allowed me now. So good morning, everyone. So thank you very much, Vera, for accommodating the time adjustment for our subtopic presentation. Together with Said Akman and Xingquantu, I'm in charge of addressing subtopic 5, which focuses on promoting greater participation of micro, small, and medium enterprises in trade and investment. We were requested to give a brief overview of our subtopic. In our discussions, we've identified several key priorities within our subtopic, including addressing challenges faced by MSMEs due to digital transformation in cross-border trade, environmental standards, and sustainable investments. Additionally, we are exploring strategies to integrate MSMEs into global supply chains and examining the impact of those disruptive geopolitical changes that Vera just mentioned on those enterprises. Our main objective is really to understand the unique challenges of those enterprises within the current geoeconomic landscape of trade and investment. We think that our subtopic works more closely with those that have been dealt within subtopic 6 on neo-protectionism and GVCs, global value chains. But we recognize that challenges addressed by subtopic 2 on food and security and climate action, 4 digital transformation, and 3 gender also intersect within our work. About the abstracts that were submitted to our subtopic, we received a limited number of competitive proposals. Notable submissions include one proposing a G20 compact to enable a just and green transition for MSMEs in emerging economies, as well as 2 others that we are suggesting a potential merger, one focusing on GVC integration in Africa and the Pacific, and another centered on bioeconomy and MSMEs. So thank you for your valuable time. Regrettably, I have a prior commitment on Tuesdays with FAPESP Scientific Steering Committee. So Magali Prieto will be stepping in for me for the remainder of today's session. Wishing you all continued success in your endeavors. Thank you, Vera. Thank you all.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, as you can see, small, medium enterprise, micro enterprise is a universe in itself. It's you have to deal with all the big issues of the WTO. Let me jump now to topic 1. That is the main topic of the 20 is trade and investment to fight inequality, poverty, hunger, and social inclusion is another word in itself. For this, I'd like to invite Dr. Valeria Pinheiro. She is from Argentina, but now living in the US. And she is working with International Food Research Institute. Célio Iratuca from Unicamp is working with her, and Mr. Bepul Chattopadhyay from CUTS is also in the group. Please, Valeria, the floor is yours. Valeria, can somebody help Valeria to speak? I saw her.
Yes, indeed. It took a little bit to unmute from your side. So good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for some of you. So yes, I'm Valeria Piñeiro, and first of all, I would like to mention that Celio and before also commented on this. So for us, is the subgroup number 1, as Vera just mentioned, we received 10 abstracts. And as Michelle just pointed out, there is some overlap with some of the other subgroups from this task force number 4, especially subgroup number 2. But for our subgroup, we will definitely focus on how agricultural trade through value addition can help achieve food security. This is the key word that we're trying to figure out here, reduce poverty and foster social inclusion. In that manner, it will align with Brazil's G20 initiative on global alliance against hunger and poverty, but also will continue to build on the work of the G7 led through the Global Alliance for Food Security. So in order to achieve this objective, as I just mentioned, we're looking into some priorities that we really want to address, which most of them really relates specifically with food security as the main point, but there are some other ones that will create that enabling environments that we will also need to achieve these priorities. And some of them are to identify the measures to achieve food security through global trade by facilitating and promoting trade agreements and additional measures from the international community. The second one will be that given that global food production is dependent on the utilization of natural resources and climate conditions, and the concerns on climate and environmental are creating these trade standards that actually Vera already mentioned that negatively affect food trade. We really need to identify how these concerns can be addressed by international cooperation and funding. And we will also pay special attention on this inclusion. So looking at products that really accommodate women and youth and some other groups. The third one will be to adopt specific measures to protect food trade and food supplies from the geopolitical events, especially to poor net food importing countries. The fourth one will be to adopt measures to avoid price volatility, reduce risk, and promote the balance between global issues and domestic needs in agricultural products, obviously into this context of climate change. The fifth one will be to strengthen the WTO provisions dealing with export restrictions, particularly on agri-food items. And then these next three are more this broader environment that I was mentioning, that it is international investment agreements, but include guarantees that states can effectively regulate and contribute to the sustainable energy transition and promote investment in technology transfers to improve global tax justice and corporate transparency, identify corporate and financial regulatory measures that create these imbalances and symmetries between and within countries. And then the last one will be to accelerate discussion in multilateral forums to allow greater policy space to developing countries facing geopolitical changes related to industrial sectors, mainly on issues concerned with the agreement on trade-related investment measures and the TRIPS as well. So this will be a very short summary of our priorities and what we're looking forward to work with in the next months with everybody else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valeria. Now you can see how you are working, right? Our group is doing rounds of discussions, streamlining the points that we are going to present in our a final report. Let me put more items on the discussion. Let me go to item 2, and that is about food security and climate, energy, all the big issues of the moment. And for this group, we have Marcos Yank and Camila Diassá from INSPER Brazil. We have Noemi Laurent from Canada, now living in Geneva, and Kennedy Mubeba from Kenya, that living in Oxford. This is a global world. Now, Marcos Yank, if you can jump in, you have the microphone. Where is Marcos? Well, I saw him there. No. It's a leg, you know, of the instruction from Sebri to the speakers. Marcos is there? Sebri, Marcos cannot speak.
Okay. Hello. Yes. Okay. Oops, it works now.
Great.
There's a lag for everybody here,
Yeah,
on the mute. Okay. Thank you, Vera. Thank you very much to everybody. It's a big pleasure to be here, and a big pleasure to be working with Camila Dias de Sá from our institute, from our Center on Global Agribusiness Studies, Noemi Lawrence from Graduate Institute in Geneva, and Ken Mbeva from Cambridge. So it's a pleasure to have them. We received at the Trade and Investment, Food Security, and Climate Action. This is the name of TF 4.2. We received 32 papers, and we selected 28 papers. So it's a huge amount of papers in this area. So it was very interesting to see how people were interested in presenting paper and presenting ideas about food security, climate, trade, and investment. And I believe that this is one of the most important topics for the developing countries today. So the priorities of Task Force 4.2 on food security is first, foster open markets with standards and regulations that promote competition and sustainability without risking food security. The second priority is climate change-related provisions in trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties in face of just transition. Number three, and a very important topic, voluntary sustainability standards and climate clubs. The efficacy taking into account diverse realities and the right to development. So more stringent climate policies and the consequences in terms of standards, international standards. And four, regional cooperation to expand sustainable agricultural production models that contribute to food security, the creation of good quality jobs, and climate mitigation. So these were the four priorities of this group. And we received, as I told you, 28 papers, so a very large number of papers. And I'll just put some of the main topics that emerged from those papers. One very important topic was the nexus between food security, energy transition, and environmental justice. So this is three very important topics, especially after the pandemic, the wars, and the climate problems everywhere in the world. So what's the link between food security, energy security, and climate security? And there are a few papers talking about these three areas that are absent in public policies and trade agreements. So there is not enough consideration to these three topics altogether, the interface between those topics in public policies and in trade agreements. Especially here in Brazil, we see that all three areas are so important, but the interface between energy, food, and climate is still very weak in terms of public policies. The second topic was the strong interest and concern regarding food security today. So food security is back to the stage. It's a very old issue, as everybody knows, but the last years, especially the 4 last years, we have lots of issues in the world regarding food security, especially in developing countries, and very especially in Africa and Middle East and South Asia. So strong interest in this topic. The third point was expanding food strategically to reduce production and consumption imbalances and minimize risks of disruptions. So this is also very important in terms of food trade as a way to reduce production and consumption imbalances in the world. So considering trade as a solution, there are many countries today talking about food sovereignty, protectionism, see things like national production instead of international, local instead of global. But there is an issue that we cannot solve problems of affordability, food safety, sustainability, just considering the national borders. It's important to consider the possibility to have trade happening everywhere in the world, especially between developing countries in Asia, Africa, and South America, which is today the big imbalances in the world. Latin America has a big surplus, Asia has a big deficit, and these imbalances, the only way to solve those imbalances is using trade as a way to reduce food insecurity. So there was a topic in this area that was quite important in terms of food trade and production and consumption imbalances in the world. The other topic, it's also very important, a very strong concern for fairer and more development-friendly policies at the intersection between trade and environment. And this is especially important for CBAN and EUDR. So there's a lot of concerns about the application of EUDR in developing countries and the implications of EUDR and CBAN to developing countries. So fairer and more development-friendly policies at the intersection between trade and environment. Also, another topic is a concern about the issue of adopting sustainability and greener trade drivers without affecting development. It's more or less the same, but there's a very interesting title here from one of the papers, The Green Squeeze in the Developing World, the risk of a green squeeze in developing world. So there's a lot of issues about all the trade drivers, sustainability trade drivers that would affect developing countries. And the other topic was advanced harmonization and mutual recognition of sustainability standards across high and low income countries. So the consideration of science-based standards and standards that follow international trade rules, and the harmonization and mutual recognition of those sustainability standards. And finally, capacity building for a just transition, funding for technical, technological, and capacity improvements and economic incentives. So a lot of papers, 28 papers, so you have a lot of work to do now, but I believe that most of the papers are really interesting, and we are going to have a very hot session of discussions, very hot discussions about this interface between trade, food security, and climate. Thank you very much, Vera.
Thank you, Marcos. As you can see, this issue on food security and climate, it's a big one. I love what happened yesterday when Dr. Maria João said that if you cannot agree internationally on standards, the European Union is going to impose a standard upon the world. Come on, we have to do something else. We have to think, rethink, tank. You cannot wait more for the agreement on agriculture on WTO. What you can do to help put a little bit order on this food area. Now, there's a lot of things to discuss, right? I will provoke you later. Now, let's go to topic 3. Is again, really important, is completely horizontal issue, that is women in trade. The man said to me, why you have to have a woman in trade? Sorry, for thousands of years, we have to fight for space. Sorry for that, woman is on the front door. Who is taking care of this discussion is Marina Carvalho from Women in Trade in Brazil, a very aggressive organization, and Rita Mario from Mexico, and Jean-Yves Remy, our lady from Barbados, that now is leading at a person discussing environment issues and that are so important for us. Now, Marina, let's see if you can speak, if the organizers allow you to speak. You have, yes.
Yes, okay, oh, that was good. So hello, good morning, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank Professor Vera Torstensen and the organizers for the opportunity of participating in such an important discussion. So as Vera mentioned, my name is Marina Carvalho. I am currently the chairman of the board of the Women Inside Trade organization. And together with Amrita Bari from Itani University in Mexico and Jean-Yves Remy, director of the Shirida Rampel Center, we are the co-chairs of subtopic 3, Women in Trade, from this task force. And as Vera mentioned, this topic is fundamental, but it comes as part of the solution, I think, for many of the challenges mentioned by Professor Vera in her opening remarks. And a confirmation of this perception was the creation in 2023 for the first time in the G20 of the Working Group for Women Empowerment. So with this in mind, we have come across in discussions the main priorities of this subtopic, which we understand would be crucial for the G20 to discuss and provide 3 practical recommendations. So the priorities we had were, first, data collection, both quantitative and qualitative, to identify intersection between trade and women and measure the impact of trade agreements so we can inform policymakers at pre, during, and post-trade negotiation stages, taking into account the different domestic conditions, priorities, and needs. The second topic is negotiation and implementation of investment agreements and policies, but with a women-centric lens in different areas, such as capacity building, access to finance, SMEs, investment assistance, and so on. Third, mainstreaming women-related concerns to traditional trade agreements and policy areas such as technical barriers to trade, standards, tariff barriers, investment, trade facilitation, agriculture, and so on. Fourth, present the intersections, and that's a word I think that was very much mentioned yesterday and today, the intersection between the topics, and in this case, between women and climate change, women and new sustainability issues such as blue economy, digital trade, biodiversity, bringing women and new groups, including non-traditional genders, race, religion, physical conditions, indigenous groups. And so this intersection is really a core priority. And lastly, but not less important, I think the main role that we discussed here is how the G20 process and negotiations can serve as a platform for facilitating learning and exchange of practices across countries and regions for women empowerment. And this could involve reflecting diverse and bottom-up approaches tailored to meet the unique development needs of various countries and groups. So considering those priorities, we have received 9 abstracts. We hoped we had more, but those abstracts were very well written. 5 were considered accepted by the group. We have one about collection of data, which is one of our key priorities. We have one about including a women-centric lens in international agreement. So this is also fit into our previous thoughts. And the other 3 are respectively about women's position in services, tourism, and the agro-supply chain. So these 3 papers, they converge with the intersection between women and other trade topics. And we are very eager to understand how they are going to be drafted in the end. We still lack some views which are key in this subject, such as the G20 role as a platform for learning, which we hope it could be addressed somehow by this group. So Professor Vera, this is the wrap up of subtopic 3, and we are open for discussions and look forward to any inputs you may have. Thank you so much.
Great, Marina. I hope that we can help us to have a parallel seminar to discuss all these issues on women. Now, let's go to one of the most challenging item, that is digital transformation and how we can fit trade and investment inside. And for this topic, we have Carlos Primo Braga from Dom Cabral, IMD very known specialist in this. Douglas Lippold from US, and Matilda Ferracani from Italy. She has a marvelous project on digital regulation around the world. Carlos, you have the microphone. If the organizers allow us.
I guess they allowed us.
Great.
So nice to be with you all. Our terms of reference were basically to consider the increasing role of digital transactions to foster trade and investment, and the task force should explore how trade and investment can harness digital technologies for increased efficiency, innovation, and global connectivity. I have, in one word, if we analyze the abstracts that we received, I would say good. In 2 words, not good, because we only received 4 abstracts. We accepted 3. We had identified as main topics for discussions the whole question about interoperability to support companies in offering their service online across the globe. We had also identified the question of participation of emerging and developing economies in digital trade, and particularly the role of small and medium enterprise in this context. And last but not least, the question of how artificial intelligence is being treated in the context of trade agreements. There is a new array of new regional trade agreements that have chapters on this topic. Among the abstracts that we received, one deals specifically with the question of how to create a digital-friendly climate for investment. So it's pretty much the issue that we had identified as one of the relevant issues. The other is very much in the context of the trade facilitation agreement concerns with respect to how to advance paperless trade, interoperability, mutual recognition of electronic documents. And last but not least, with respect to digital inclusion, the role of a small and medium enterprise, and what can the G20 do to enhance business access to trade. So that's about it.
Thank you, Carlos. As you can see, all our issues are merging. So you are going to have a lot of work to put all of this in our final report. Let me move to the other item, is about neo-protectionism. And the question is, what is neo-protectionism? And GVCs. Do you have GVCs? They are they are globalized still. For discuss this, we have Professor Liane Naidin and Lia Valls from CINDES Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Martin Mitz from Geneva, and Faisal Ismail from South Africa. So we have had very nice discussions on this issue. Please, Professor Liane, the microphone is yours.
Hi, Vera. Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you for giving me and our team the opportunity to participate in this event. As Vera has already mentioned, we have discussed this issue thoroughly among ourselves, among the team. And I will present the main lines of the issues we discussed amongst ourselves. And also were very well covered by the abstracts we received. We received 14 abstracts, from which we accepted 12. As Vera mentioned before, with regard to other issues, this issue also has various intersections with other issues, but they were very clearly focused. So we hope to get an objective and clear discussions from the results of them. I will represent then the main lines of the issues we discussed. And we have three topics that we have selected, let's say, from our discussions with regard to the priorities that should be addressed. The first one is to define the problem. What is our problem? As Vera mentioned, what is new protectionism and its economic or political economics characteristics and impacts? What is the second topic? What is the best policy to handle it? And third, implementation issues to be addressed. So with regard to our problem, now protectionism is presently understood as the surge on the implementation of traditional trade protection policies, characterized by an increase on border restriction measures, industrial policies based on government subsidies, local content requirements, reference to domestic companies in government procurement, and export credits, as we all know them from a long time ago, among others. The motivations for these measures actually in present times are somewhat different. The motivations can be divided into three broad categories. The first is related to the management of public policies, statecraft, addressed to protect national securities, and I put it in brackets. The measures under this concept are justified as instruments to neutralize import dependency, to promote self-sufficiency, and to protect and stimulate basic and high technology industries. In addition to import and export restrictions, measures are put in place limiting access to technology, licenses, and redirecting flows of foreign direct investment. It is important to note that the concept of national security remains largely undefined in WTO. The second is related to industrial targeting. The economic trade and investment landscape is rapidly changing due to technological advances, as we know, affecting competition. The COVID pandemic has had its effects and has triggered a new wave of industrial targeting policies in support of technology-intensive production involving unprecedented amounts of government subsidies, and such on three continents, including North America, Asia, and Europe. The third one is related to energy transition, naturally a global concern. In this case, it is necessary to evaluate the balance between true global concerns and protectionist measures imposed unilaterally. The emergency of climate change mitigation has been used as a motivation for the adoption of climate policies with trade and investment impacts. These trends have been endorsing the implementation of new protectionist trade and investment policies with negative implications for international competition, specifically for the developing world. Border carbon adjustment measures or deforestation regulation are examples of new environmental policies with impacts on trade. They are promoted to foster reindustrialization or are due to a response to security concerns in a scenario of energy transition. Besides, in many cases, they do not comply with WTO commitments. More, what is the best policy to handle it? Now, protectionist trade and foreign investment policies have important implications for developed countries, and most importantly, for the developing world. Protection against imports from other countries more competitive producers of industrial inputs, capital, and goods have negative impacts on global trade, productivity, income, and economic growth. Most of all, they represent a loss of offer for societies, particularly for emerging and least developing countries. At the multilateral level, it requires the reinforcement of cooperation and the implementation of better and transparent regulatory frameworks. There is not a single best policy to handle all the scope of protectionist trade and investment measures. The general framework must depart from the commitment to establish a set of rules that comply with G20 priorities. In the case of trade policies, it must ensure that these policies will not impair the aim of combating hunger, poverty, and inequality. Moreover, the pursuit of the three dimensions of sustainable development, economic, social, and environment must be present in the trade agenda. Also, we must consider the difference in the degrees of development. Finally, what is the best policy to handle it? The main challenge is to balance domestic interests with the aim of ensuring a multilateral trade environment that generates positive effects to income growth, especially in developing countries. Certain issues like subsidies that have already been mentioned, government procurement and investment requirements must be addressed at some points must be considered. In the case of government support policies such as subsidies, this implementation should be done transversally in the economy, in the production sector, and envisage dynamic positive effects in the economy. One example is naturally on energy transition. It is important to distinguish government support measures associated with energy transition from subsidy policies and cross-border protection, which are not always transparent. This challenge is to promote higher levels of economic integration and social welfare while implementing the transversion government industrial policies to support and facilitate the transition. Transition to low carbon production requires new processes, technological adaptations, and innovation in many sectors in the economy. Their implementation often requires government subsidies throughout upstream or downstream production chains. These policies may generate dynamic positive effects throughout the whole economy. They include government support policies that facilitate access to public goods, has training, and development of new skills. The same consideration naturally must guide the debate on incentives or general subsidies policies with regard to other specific measures. There is not a theoretical best policy to handle, an issue that depends on negotiations amongst countries. The G20 can play an important role in identifying possible areas of consensus. We can envisage a new or revised multilateral framework for the industrial sector. That is an open question. Could the evaluation of the impact of these measures on the domestic prospects of long-term growth be taken into account? Other question. The G20 has a relevant role in those regards, in stimulating WTO members to review, refine, update, and strengthen the subsidies agreement. At the end of the day, developing countries are the most harmed by subsidy policies, as they are unable to compete in this field with richer countries. Also, we have to take into account the budget constraints faced by developing countries in a much more urgent way than by more developing ones.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leonie. Very good. So let me wrap up and finish the session because we are out of time already. Please send us your questions, your concerns, your things that you are interested in. As you can see, this group is fabulous. We know the questions, we know the problems, all of them. The point is what we can do, what's the message you are going to send to G20? Are you going to wait for the old WTO organization to be revived, or we can do something? Can we imagine new arrangements, new sectorial agreements on standards? What to do with all this, the question of neo-industrialization? My point that is really concerns me is that without WTO, without a progress, a light in front of us, do you know what's going on? A fight, a war on trade instruments between the global south and the north, in the sense that, come on, go to the newspapers. You are seeing Brazil asking for anti-dumping as ever. Come on, the lawyers will love this. You are asking for anti-subsidies against the global north. Why not? Why developing country cannot have CBAMs and all these voluntary standards? We know this. We know all the instruments. What the members of that WTO is waiting? We are going to have trade wars because of the disfragmentation of the world. So be ready for our final report. With these words, sorry to be aggressive, this is our word. I return the microphone to our Minister Almir. Please, Almir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Torstensen and co-chairs, for this inspiring exchange of ideas and insights, for diagnosing the problems we have in world trade, underscoring the importance of WTO. We all remain with this challenging question that you pose: who is ruling world trade? I now pass the floor to Dr. Ana Sajoro Garcia, lead co-chair of Task Force 3, Reforming the International Financial Architecture, to walk us through the task force and serve as moderator of the ensuing panel. Dr. Ana Garcia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Almir. Do you hear me all?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So good morning to everybody. Good afternoon to some of our colleagues and co-chairs. I am Ana Garcia. I am associated researcher and former director of the BRICS Policy Center. I'm also a professor of the Federal Rural University of Rio de Janeiro in international political economy. And I have the honor and the privilege to be the lead co-chair of this task force with my colleague Haihong Gao. She's director of the Institute of World Economics and Politics of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, who is here also joining us in the public. And me and Haihong also have the valuable and wonderful help of two task force assistants, Dr. Lucas Carames from the BRICS Policy Center and Dr. Wanting Xiao from the IWEP. So the existing international financial architecture was established in the aftermath of World War II and is increasingly showing signs of obsolescence and has been ineffective in addressing rapidly evolving development challenges and facilitating the achievement of sustainable development goals. Designed by and for developed countries in a time when such issues such as the climate change and other issues received little attention, today's systems is also characterized by highly interconnected financial markets, rapid technological and demographic developments, and global interest rates hikes and pressures coming from international financial architecture failures. It's fundamental to change and to address the reform of the international financial architectures, its deficiencies inherent from its designs, and the new challenges posed by adverse shocks. These pressing issues are, first, the widening financing gaps for SDGs and the debt distress in the global south. Developing countries face rising borrowing costs and reduced access to global financial markets as a result of monetary tightening. High debt services burdens crowd out public investments in SDG-related areas, especially in low and income countries. The Paris Agreement goal of mobilizing $100 billion per year to support climate action in developing countries has not been fully met. And the agreement between the G20 and the Paris Club on a common framework of debt treatment is very important, but still falls short for a fair and effective solution for countries in debt distress. A second pressing issue is the sluggish governance reform, particularly in the Bretton Woods institutions, where voting powers does not reflect the shift in global economic power. In particular, the importance of emerging markets and developing countries is severely underrepresented, and the voting reforms in these institutions lags far behind in terms of gender, racial, and regional balance. The lack of balance of power does not only undermine the fairness in those institutions, but also reduce its relevance to new global challenges. A third pressing issue is the volatile financial markets and recurrent financial crisis. This is the very topic at the heart of the G20's origins back in the 1990s and also in the 2008 crisis. Highly integrated financial markets are vulnerable to cross-border contagion, and technological innovations pose challenges to financial regulations. The gap between available financing resources in crisis times and the demand are trillions of dollars. There are wide disparities in countries' access to liquidity in times of crisis, with only a small share of special drawing rights allocated to vulnerable developing economies. The multi-layered global financial safety net designed to ensure global financial stability is fragmented and inadequate. And a fourth and very important for this year's presidency of the G20 is the unfair international tax architecture. This was a very hot topic of last week's finance track meeting. While it is essential for countries to rely on domestic resources to finance their sustainable and equitable development, global tax evasion and avoidance are hampering their ability to raise funds. To combat tax avoidance and evasion and other illicit financial flows, as well as to address the imbalance in the allocation of taxing rights between developed and developing countries, the architecture of the international tax cooperation is to be strengthened. Bank secrecy, increasing digitalization, and the lack of tax transparency have allowed wealthy individuals and families, as well as multinational corporations, to exploit loopholes and shift profits from low or non-tax jurisdiction, despite the rules of the OECD inclusive framework. This inclusive framework also suffers from governance deficit, which results in its work prioritizing the interests of developed countries and preventing effective and inclusive participation of developing countries. So, as representatives of the world's major developed and developing economies, the G20 leaders face today a precious moment for the reform of the international financial architecture. For the first time, countries of the Global South have a chance to lead the G20 agenda setting in a consecutive years process. So it's time to rethink the principles of economic governance and expand the possibilities of governance and societies in low and income countries to pursue economic development. Our task force is composed by specialists, academics, and also representatives of countries in the Global South and the developing world, coming from various think tanks, international organizations, and different universities from different countries. And its main aim is to support the G20 in discussing and effectively reforming the international financial architecture. So it's time that we put the needs of developing countries in the very center of decision and the very center of every mechanism. We are privileged, I would say, and it's an honor for me and Hai Hong to coordinate this task force composed by 16 co-chairs coming from various parts of the world, as I just said, Turkey, Brazil, US, Belarus, UK, Argentina, South Africa, France, Spain, India, and others. We've received 85 abstracts in a total. We've approved a total of 68 abstracts. They are pretty much balanced along the 5 subtopics that we have. I will start, we have 5, as I said, not 6 as others or 7. And I will start by the last one, just as Vera Torstensen just made, because it's the very heart of what culminates in the resources that we are leveraging by reforming the international financial architecture, which is the overall SDG financing needs, the pathways, and the role of the reform of the international financial architecture. The subtopic is composed by Dr. Nilanjan Goff of ORF India, Dr. Amar Bhattacharya from the Brookings Institution in the US, and Dr. Fernanda Feo from the Federal University in Brazil. So I invite Dr. Amar Bhattacharya to present this subtopic, the main objectives, the main issues that you think it's important to share with our colleagues.
Thank you, Ana Garcia. And thank you, Hayong. Privilege for me to present this on behalf of Nilanjan Ghosh, Fernanda Fell, and myself. As you said, this is a cross-cutting subtopic. The title is Outlining Pathways to Fulfill Overall Sustainable Development Goals, Financing Requirements. And many of the issues, therefore, that we deal with are really already very well covered in your opening remarks. As you highlighted, the world is behind on most SDGs, more than half the way to the 2030 target. The world is even more behind in meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And at the heart of the shortfall is an underperformance in investment and development spending in the South on SDGs. And assessments show that between now and 2030, spending on SDGs will need to more than double to around 5.4 trillion per year in developing countries, including most from the South, as well as particularly meeting the gap in the poorest countries, including Africa. The scale of this investment will require a financing strategy that leads to a major expansion and revamp of all sources of finance, domestic and international, public and private. But it will only happen with a major reform of the international financial architecture, as Ana Garcia pointed out. The approach must utilize the complementary strengths of the different pools of finance to ensure that we have the right scale, the right kind of finance. It must reduce the cost of capital, which has been particularly problematic in financing the green transition, and it must embody a holistic and comprehensive approach, and it must align finance with sustainability and climate goals. Key to this will be developing partnerships to deliver concrete results. And in all of this, of course, the G20 has a crucial role to play. One way to think about it is that we need now finance that is suited to move the world economy to sustainability that delivers on both SDGs and climate. And for that, two things are absolutely necessary. First, we need to mobilize finance at scale to support SDGs and climate, but we also need to green and make the financial system more sustainable. And for that, we need policies that align, in some sense, all financial flows with sustainability, requiring changes in regulations and directing flows to those activities that are supporting the sustainability and development objectives, but also discouraging financial flows to those activities that are not sustainable. Now, the agenda that we have in the 4 subtopics that will follow really relate very closely then to the elements of the 68 abstracts that we have received. There are many cross-cutting elements that are brought together in the way that I mentioned, including issues around health, including blended finance. There are also some innovative proposals that we have received. One, for example, deals with intergenerational equity and the perspective of the South. Another deals with the whole possibilities and potential of the SDRs. And there's one proposal that deals with mapping solutions, so tracking and mapping solutions, so that we have a real-time, in some sense, assessment of what's going on. And several of the briefs deal with the cross-cutting elements of international financial architecture reform. So this is a crucial year. The Brazilian G20 has a great opportunity to build on the Indian G20 agenda, which put SDGs and green financing at the center. This is also a year where we are dealing with multiple crises. So we do believe that our task force can provide really concrete solutions in the areas that Ana Garcia highlighted.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amar. It's really great to count not only on your expertise, but also on your experience in previous T20s and the G20s process, as well as all the knowledge that you deliver from the Brookings Institution. So thank you very much. I want to highlight also how pleasant it has been to work with this group of co-chairs, because it's a very, very cooperative group. Everyone speaks to each other. We agree on issues. They deliver everything on time, which is great for us as lead co-chairs. And now I move to the first and second subtopics. And these are, as I said previously, at the very heart and the very origin of the G20 in its 25 years. The first one is the financial system rules and regulations and the global governance safety nets to promote stability, sustainability, and equity. This subtopic is composed by Dr. Gubin Sahi Beyoglu from TEPAF, Turkey, Maria Antonieta Lins from the IR Institute USP, Brazil, and Marina Zucker Marquez from the Global Development Policy Center at the Boston University. And I invite Marina to take the floor and please present the main issues concerning your area and your subtopic.
Thank you very much, Ana. And I'm sure for the other members and co-chairs, it's been a pleasure to work with other co-chairs and with Ana and Hai-Hong. So I will, as Ana mentioned, first it's a pleasure to be part of the T20. And as Ana mentioned, along with Gopin and Maria Antonieta, I've been co-leading the first track, named the Financial System Rules and Regulations, the Global Financial Safety Nets, to promote stability, sustainability, and equity. So our objective has very strong similarities with the overall priorities of the Brazilian presidency in the G20, namely diminishing inequalities. But rather than looking to within countries inequalities and specifically to poverty ratios, we are looking to the international financial system, and especially how the structure of the financial safety net is biased against lower income countries. This is because not only they have less access to resources like swaps, regional financial arrangements, and IMF limited resources, but because they have less voice in the system. So the system as it is now, it reinforces these already existing inequalities. And this is, as I said, for instance, through the quotas of the IMF, which influence their voice in the system, but also the allocation of new resources. An example of this is the distribution of the special drawing rights. So, for instance, Africa, the whole continent, receives about 3% of the overall special drawing rights, although there are very high needs for new liquidity in the continent. They receive very small share because the quotas underrepresent the continent, right? Apart from this, we have the IMF conditionalities or surcharges that make countries to pay a higher price when they least can afford it. So bearing this context in mind, our goal in this T20, in this task force, is to make the system to work for everyone. This is the key for us. So we need to make not only the global financial safety net bigger, but better and more equitable. And this is especially important in a system that has increasingly shocks and high volatility. And this is another key point to diminish these shocks and this volatility in the system. So from one side, we need to make the system that the emergency liquidity finance better, quicker, more equitable, and we also have to make the system less volatile with less shock. In this sense, our task force the track number 1, we are very much aligned, for instance, with the debt discussion, because if the global financial safety net does not deliver what we need, the liquidity that is fast for developing countries, the problems can become very quickly a solvency problem, and countries can go on a debt path, that crisis path. And also, our task is also very connected to the task force number 6, because to push the reforms, and also the track number 5 in this task force, because to push for reforms, we need a holistic approach. We need more multilateralism between and support between global South and global North, but also South-South cooperation to make the global financial safety net work better. So a little bit reflecting on the policy brief we receive, our track, we receive over 15 policy briefs, and we're very pleased to see a number of them addressing this exactly problem of the inequality, of bringing more stability to the system, making it bigger, better, and also more equitable. We have a number of papers discussing how to make the system more stable. And this includes, for instance, now the role of CBDCs in that process. How can it bring more volatility or not? The regulation of systematically important banks in the system. But we also receive very good numbers of papers discussing the issues of emergency liquidity, specifically for distribution of swaps, the need to have regional financial arrangements, and also the question of the governance in the system. IMF reforms was another topic that we received, especially regarding the overall interest policy of the IMF, and also surcharges, that it has been an issue for countries that are accessing the global financial safety net. So yeah, this is an overview of the track, and I pass on back to Anna. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marina, very much. I also need to highlight that Marina is working on a proposal together with Pablo Nemina from Argentina on a side event on the IMF reform and the debt issues. So very, very important issue to discuss, and also to elaborate, to help us on the final recommendations and conclusions of our task force. Subtopic number 2 is also in the very heart of the G20's origin, and particularly was a hot topic during the financial crisis in the late 2000s, which is the multilateral development bank reform, what better, bigger, and more effective entails. The subtopic is coordinated and composed by Professor Hernanes Torres from the Institute of Economics of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Dr. Artem Levinkov from the Euro-Asian Fund for Stabilization and Development in Belarus, and Dr. Pridayarshi Dash from RRS in India. And I must also emphasize that this topic is being worked in form of a roadmap by our colleague Karen Vasquez in the Ministry of Finance in Brazil, with whom we are developing a closer dialogue. So I invite Dr. Artem Levinkov to present the main issues of this subtopic.
Thank you, dear colleagues. It's a great pleasure for me to present our subtopic. And first of all, I want to thank our leading co-chairs, Anna and Haihon, for organizing our work, and Sure for excellent presentation of our task force. Also, many thanks to my colleagues, Dash and Ernani. And just to begin, I should say that multilateral development banks have an increasingly important role to play in responding to current economic challenges. In particular, reform of MDBs is on top of the agenda. Emerging markets and developing countries need more external financial support to address their growing financial needs, to achieve SDGs, combat climate change, fund infrastructure development, etc. However, high borrowing costs and mounting debt service burden impair their ability to do so. That is why MDBs should play a leading role in solving such issues in the form of financial support, as well as providing advisory, research, and capacity building for sustainable finance. It is estimated that MDBs should provide around $260 billion in additional annual official financing to achieve their sustainable development goals by 2030. This requires both more capital and more efficient use of the existing MDBs available resources and instruments, a reformed and strengthened structure and greater coordination among MDBs to increase also their lending capacity. The G20 could play a leading role in propelling the MDBs system into a new era. The G20 has deliberated on comprehensive reform of MDBs during past two presidencies, especially enhancing their lending capacity, promoting effective use by aligning their lending programs with country platforms, promoting innovative instruments for climate change, and among others. The Larry Summers and committee report called the Triple Agenda came up during Indian presidency has inspired us and MDBs to work intensively on enhancing their mandates, raising additional resources, and enhancing operational models and eligibility frameworks to face the pressing agenda. Building upon previous work on the CAF review and strengthening MDBs, during the Indonesian and Indian presidencies, the Brazilian presidency of the G20 aims to establish a comprehensive roadmap for a better, bigger, and more effective system of MDBs. We received plenty of abstracts, and 13 of them were accepted. The abstracts we received cover different aspects of MDBs functioning, from financing in the local currencies, options for SDR rechanneling to enhancing efficiency of MDBs operations, and also rethinking the anti-crisis agenda of MDBs within the global financial safety net. In the forthcoming policy briefs, we expect to receive practical solutions which we could put forward into policy recommendations to G20 officials involved in the Sherpa and finance tracks in the form of a final communique and task force recommendations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Arthur. It was a very comprehensive and important presentation of this issue, which is so important for this year's G20 in Brazil. So the last two subtopics, I think they're so interesting because they are not in the origin of the G20, as I was saying before, but they have become increasingly important in the latest years. Not because they are, fashion, but because of the really desperate situation of developing countries. Subtopic number 3 addresses the debt burden in developing countries and facilitating their access to concessional resources. And we are very worried and concerned about bringing to this subtopic, especially it's coming from very affected regions and countries. So we brought Pablo Neminia from Argentina, from Flaxo and UNASAM and CONICET Argentina. We brought Daniel Bradlow from University of Pretoria in South Africa, and we combined them with two specialists working in these areas now for years, which are Ulif Volts from SOAS in the UK and Martin Kessler from FinDeLab France, the Finance for Development Lab. And I will invite now Martin to speak on behalf of this group. I think that you have a very important role because, as you've pointed in our discussions, in our concept note, how the G20 has become now the main forum, the main space to discuss debt renegotiation, debt relief, and debt-related issues. So not the Paris Club anymore, but the G20 as a space, a forum which includes old creditors, but also new creditors. So please, Martin.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, and thanks to my co-chairs, Pablo, Uli, and Danny. Indeed, I think the topic of debt has become very central for developing countries and has become a major theme of G20 meetings. And I think it's a clear priority of the G20 Brazilian presidency to put debt and its architecture at the center, in particular on how it affects the priorities of development, the fight against hunger, and how development and climate protection can be thwarted, can have problem developing with increasing pressure of debt. And so taking those priorities into account, our subgroup wanted to highlight how the rising debt levels that has started since before COVID, but that especially exploded with the COVID crisis and then geopolitical tensions, are putting these objectives of development of climate protection into danger. First, for countries that are entering debt distress, going through the process of restructuring debt, which with the G20 Paris Club Common Framework has become central, the central task of the G20, we can see that the framework to restructure debt has become too slow, too uncertain for developing countries. And so this is because of a lack of a legal binding, sustainable mechanism that would allow creditors and debtors to agree on a restructuring. Second, and to highlight that these costs, these delays fall on the citizens, on countries, on developing countries especially, and they create uncertainty, they create lack of investment in the development priorities. Second, even for countries that do not have an outright debt crisis, we can see rising debt service. And with high levels of debt, with high cost of debt, this debt service don't necessarily create outright debt crisis, but they create silent development crisis, where governments have to take money for development purposes, for investment in social protection, in food security, against the climate crisis, and divert it towards servicing their debt. And so this is why we believe that this topic was central, and we received a lot of proposals dealing with those interactions between debt and climate, with interacting with the role of MDBs, of the global financial safety net, as highlighted by Marina. We received 27 papers, and I think we can have three main categories. Those dealing with the process of debt restructuring, which again has become a major task of G20 International Financial Architecture Group, and how to accelerate the debt treatment. I think this also goes to the heart of what Ambassador Mauricio Lirio put as a task of the T20, is to propose reforms of the not only of policies but also of institutions. How to reform the common framework is a major institutional reforms, and how to bring more voice from developing countries into it. We received several proposals on that. Second, we received a lot of proposals on the interaction between debt and climate and nature crisis, biodiversity crisis. We actually had 4 proposals that were very close on debt for nature swaps, on what is the role of the G20, how they can harmonize, accelerate those transactions, and several others were around those topics, sometimes broader, how to create space for developing countries to invest in those sectors. Finally, we received proposals on the broader system, how IMF, World Bank, multilateral development bank policies in general can support debt sustainability in the long run. So I stop here, maybe with the last recommendation to the authors, if some are present, is to go towards from these very general principles to very concrete recommendations. Who can do what actions to improve to improve those institutions, and especially within the G20. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marty. Really great and comprehensive presentation. I was just a short comment. I was actually surprised that we didn't get any abstract proposal on this new issue, which is being proposed for this year G20, which is the debt for help mechanism. So we've received 3 abstracts on the issue of debt for climate, but not on the debt for health. which is a new subject that needs to be discussed. I think we do need a good evaluation on the effects and consequences and the opportunities given by the debt for climate mechanism, which is there for now more than a decade. But on this new issue that is being proposed by the Brazilian presidency, we have not received it, and I think that we need to promote a space for discussion on that. Last but definitely not least, because it was in the very front of the media and headlines of newspapers last week because of the finance track meeting in Sao Paulo, is the issue of tax. Subtopic 4, ensuring a fair global tax architecture that facilitates domestic and international resource mobilization. This issue is being worked by Dr. Yabu Masha from the Group of 24, global organization of 24 countries working within the UN. Dr. Abdul Krodari from the South Center, also a global organization with headquarters in Switzerland, who is a specialist in this area. And Dr. Miguel Otero from the Instituto Real Elcano in Spain, who also has been working in this issue, has last week also interviewed Professor Gabriel Zuckman, who was here in Brazil and is a specialist in the proposing outcomes of this new tax cooperation to target wealthy individuals and wealthy families. And I invite Abdul to speak on behalf of the group. Abdul has very important proposals, also very important evaluations and critiques of the OECD inclusive framework. So please, Abdul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ana. Obrigado. And I'd like to start by thanking really Ana and Hai-Hong for their very dynamic leadership, very quick responses, precise feedback, which has really kept us moving in a very harmonious way. And also, of course, to my own co-chairs, Dr. Yabu Masha and Miguel Otero, for their ever reliable and harmonious teamwork. On the issue of international taxation, I would start by saying that this has become salient because of the increasing globalization, which has not given returns. International taxation addresses the redistributive component of globalization, and that is very important because so far globalization in practice has just meant reducing trade barriers and reducing investment barriers, but international taxation is about the redistribution of globalization. So this is really a very important component which will only grow more important in the years to come. And it's a genuinely historic time in the international tax system. It could be likened to the Uruguay round for the trading system or to the 1950s for the Bretton Woods. We are seeing a fundamental change in the way international tax operates. This is a genuinely historic time. And we are seeing that the changes that are taking place are not enough for the developing countries. The OECD has been perceived, rightly so, as an organization dominated by the developed countries. And the outputs that have come out have been perceived to be of minimal benefit for developing countries, especially the two-pillar solution for taxing the digital economy and for having a global minimum tax. And developing countries have responded by basically pushing a resolution in the United Nations General Assembly calling to shift power away from the OECD towards the UN. So here the G20 really has a historic opportunity to constructively contribute to this process. And our subgroup has an opportunity to contribute to the G20 to contribute to this process. And we have received some very excellent proposals, and I'm going to go through them briefly because we have received, we shortlisted 10, and these are some very interesting ideas. So one is the need for a global tax policy for the ocean. The ocean has tremendous resources, and as ocean unfortunately that's the word we use, ocean exploitation increases, then some kind of a tax policy would be required. We have a very interesting proposal by two South Asian researchers who have basically said that South Asia and Africa have been doing a lot to tax the digital economy on their own. Whereas Latin America, apart from Colombia, has been not really doing much. So they have made an appeal to Latin American countries to start introducing digital taxes and calling on Brazil to basically help all developing countries, but especially Latin American countries. We have a proposal on a minimum standard for tax expenditure reporting, which is going to be a very interesting area to look at given the global minimum tax. We have a policy brief on how the G20 could engage practically with the UN negotiations, what the framework convention, which is being designed in the United Nations, could look like with G20 engagement. We have a policy brief on how the two-pillar solution of the OECD could actually accelerate gender and racial discrimination because of the minimal revenue impacts and how that could basically exacerbate these disadvantages. And we have a proposal on how the exchange of information regime can be improved through drawing upon the experiences of Southeast Asian countries. So these are, I mean, there are more, but these are some of the more interesting ones. And we definitely look forward to translating these excellent ideas into the recommendations of the T20, which can hopefully inform the work of the G20. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abdul. Really wonderful to hear the highlights of the abstracts which came to our task force. Just to complement the overall presentation of the task force, we're planning, and we hope to do it, 3 side events. One I just mentioned on the IMF reform and the debt issue. Marina Zucker and Pablo Neminha are working on a proposal, would be a whole day or 2 mornings workshop in the context of the spring meetings of the end of April concerning the IMF reform particularly, but also dealing with climate and the debt issue. The other side event that we are planning is a side event which is already now being proposed by my colleague Paulo Esteves in the BRICS Policy Center and Priyadarshi Dash in the IRS in India on the reform of multilateral development banks. This is already has already a date. It's the 19th of April in Washington, especially working on the reform of the NDBs in the context of the spring meetings of the World Bank. And my colleague Paulo and Dash are working on the very important proposal of bringing together regional banks and putting previous discussions on the regional banks then together in Washington by the end of April. And a third side event that we wish to do, and this would be a partnership with IPEA. My colleagues in IPEA have firstly proposed a side event on the tax reform and tax architecture and tax cooperation. And I hope to do this together with my colleagues in the subtopic, and Abdul, Yabo and Miguel would be very important to think and to plan the side event, but also to include civil society organizations working in the same issue. And they are already also planning and having meetings and events. So this would be important, I think, moments to complement the work of the task force and also to help to really elaborate and bring important recommendations on all those 5 areas, all of them very, very important for the overall G20 agenda, that we count on the abstracts, on the policy briefs, on the recommendations coming from those specialists writing the policy briefs, but we move a little bit also beyond them and have also inputs and insights from others outside of the task force, but working on these very pressuring issues and topics. So this is, I think, my closing remarks. I don't see, unfortunately, any questions here. I don't know, Fabio, if we have time. Oh, okay, thank you so much. Great. Thank you, Fabio, for putting the time and the date for this one event. It's already scheduled. The other ones are being still organized. So I give the floor back to Ambassador Amir. If you don't have any questions for discussion, unless you have, we are here happy to discuss and answer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garcia. I believe we'll have some questions afterwards, no problem. This Inception Conference is for sure an opportunity to go deeper in some questions that are very important. I would like to thank then Dr. Garcia and co-chairs of Task Force 3 for showing us how important and urgent is the need to reform international financial institutions to address global challenges such as, it was mentioned here, the implementation of SDGs. As Dr. Bhattacharya stressed, 2024 is a crucial year. In both task forces, we see that presented today this morning, we see that topics and subtopics will yield fresh ideas requested by T20 by Ambassador Mauricio Lírio yesterday. We now stop for a 5-minute break and resume activities right after. Thank you. Ambassador Marcos Caramuru from SEBRE will interview Ambassador Tatiana Rosito, coordinator of the finance track of the current G20 administration and secretary of international affairs at the Ministry of Finance. Ambassador Marcos Caramuru, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us, and also Ambassador Tatiana Rosito. It's a great pleasure for T20 Brasil Inception Conference to have you with us this morning, this Brazilian morning.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening to those who are further east. Ambassador Tatiana, very good morning to you. Thank you very, very much for finding time in your very busy agenda for being with us this morning. I've seen from the papers that some of the authorities coming to the São Paulo meeting are now in Brasilia discussing with the Brazilian authorities. So I can imagine that you've been particularly busy the last few days. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We are, as Almir said, at the second day of the Inception meeting, having deep discussions on several of the topics that are covered by the financial track. The task forces, the 6 task forces that we have already selected the abstracts from more than 600 briefs that will be developed and eventually published. And I think everyone is very enthusiastic about the discussion. We have around 100 persons at the room at this point. We cannot go deep into every topic in this interview. What we expect from you is a sense of direction, a general idea of how the discussions are going on. Good morning.
Good morning, Ambassador Caramuru. It's a pleasure to be with you today and with all those that hear us. I'm here, yes, in Brasilia. Just want first to say, to congratulate you, SEBRE, FUNAG, and IPEA on the organization of this Inception Conference for T20. It's a pleasure for us. I think since the start we have mentioned how important this is for us to have this exchange of ideas. And not only for us, it's also part of the policy guidance of the Brazilian G20 presidency to outreach, to have this outreach and to discuss and exchange ideas. And we are looking forward also to July when we are actually receiving some recommendations from you.
Okay, let me start with the recent meeting of ministers and chairman of central banks. These are still pressing times, a lot of concerns with inflation, employment, monetary policy, growth in general. But at the same time, Brazil, I can imagine these were topics of discussion. At the same time, Brazil managed to include poverty alleviation as an important topic in this meeting. So give us a general sense of how the meeting worked and what do you see are the main conclusions at the meeting at this stage?
Sure. First, really on how it works, well, for you to visualize that we have almost about 80, almost like 70, almost 75 delegations around the table, both ministers of finance and central bank governors, and 16 international organizations that are permanent invitees to the finance track. And this year, the global economy, as we call session, is usually a highlight of this ministerial meetings. It's still a highlight, but we made a point of calling it, not only global economy, but perspectives for growth, jobs, inflation, and but focusing on growth and jobs. And we also proposed to start the session, actually, the first morning of the meeting. We had 4 sessions, and the first session of the ministerial on the 28th was on inequalities, on addressing or mainstreaming inequalities in macroeconomic policies. So the idea there is that as we have policymakers taking decisions on economic policies, that inequalities could be more considered. Of course, there are different also views on that. So, for example, most of central banks point out to their very important role in addressing it through their main target, right? Or through like containing inflation through what they already do. But we have a very good, actually, the theme was very well received. We feel that not only for the emerging and developing countries that are in G20, but also for advanced economies, they can connect a lot due to the great increase in inequalities, in income inequalities globally, mostly within countries in the last 20 years. There is a lot of connection also from advanced economies. There is awareness that this is creating or challenges for social cohesion. So we opened in this with inequalities, then we discussed the global economy, where ministers and governors highlighted, that we have more balanced risks and let's say a more, a balanced scenario for soft landing, but still there are concerns. Fight against inflation, prolonged inflation is not totally over, but more positive than in the last meeting. So, and then we had a third session that was concentrated. We have two different sessions, one for ministers of finance and one for governors. We discussed the taxation for the 21st century. And governors discussed financial regulation for the 21st century. So in the taxation session, we put the Brazilian agenda on the table to have, let's say, go beyond BEPS. One of our priorities is to finalize the negotiation, especially on Pillar 1 on the multilateral convention. And make sure that everyone has a fair share of that and of the revenues that will result from the sharing of excessive profits from multinationals. This, and then Pillar 2, which is the minimum 15% tax on multinationals. So we have, this is part of a global and progressive agenda on the corporate taxation. And the way we put it, the agenda, the progressive agenda that Brazil is proposing, is to say we also have to do it for individuals, right? Especially for very, high income individuals. And there I bring again, the fact that inequality and also the growth in high of the wealth and income of high net worth individuals has been tremendous in the last 20 years, while we have more stagnation on some, especially in some of the advanced economies, and if you would say class, or what we would call maybe B or and C. This is behind the elephant curve that we talk about, that experts talk about, experts on inequality, growth. So we presented the agenda, and it was very well received. And then the last session was on global debt and financing sustainable development. So we also wanted to discuss that with a more structural and long-term perspective, and also underscoring, how actually solving, that issue, the debt distress, and preventing countries to enter into that distress situation is so important also for the long-term view and for investments in sustainable development. So this was the agenda that we proposed for the first meeting. And there are some very core issues also for Brazil and part of the priorities of the agenda that we have kept for the spring meetings. So sustainable finance, climate finance, and MDB reform will be discussed in the meetings at the G20 meeting in April.
Well, let me go deeper into some of the topics that you have covered, starting with the question of debt. Debt is a pressing issue, of course, because without solving the problem of debt, at home, many indebted countries will have difficulty to make available fiscal resources to employ in development. And besides, they will not have access to new resources coming from the international reality. The common framework has been there for that management, has been there. But to my knowledge, only one country, Ghana, has been able to use the common framework and renegotiate its debt. So how do you see the path of the debt discussions during this year? Do you expect that something will be achieved at the end of the year, or it's still a long-term process to find viable solutions to the debt issue?
Ambassador, we are working to have let's say new and positive and relevant steps in treating the issue of debt and the debt of especially low-income countries and the many countries that are in distress. The common framework has been there now for about entering the fourth year. It is I think there is recognition in G20 that it is a gradual process, that we have to continue working on issues of, for example, transparency, comparability of treatment, but especially also and make it more like speedier, right? I think that is one of the main observations from countries that have actually adhered to the common framework, and the other let's say I could put it as complaint is that we don't have a mechanism for middle-income countries. So I don't see this year that we are going to work on to be able to enhance the common framework towards this direction of middle income. But we are proposing forms of treating it. We are proposing to put the agenda of the issue of liquidity pressures on the agenda, the issue of also preventing, debt distress. So the common framework offers that treatment for countries that adhere to it. You would have normal DSA from the IMF and the World Bank, and all the issues that have been difficult in the past, let's say in HIC, are there, compounded by the fact that now we have more actors on the table. Right, we have China, which is part of the common framework, and that is the big part of common. We are working together with traditional donors and China within G20, but also taking benefit of the GSDR, the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, that has been initiated by India in India's G20 last year. There, we also have more debtors around the table, and we also have the private sector. Our idea is to work, and we have proposed, for example, that we create a website for the common framework as a measure of transparency. We are trying to go one step ahead in institutionalizing the results and making them swifter. And this, it's a lot is trust building. A lot is trust building. And we believe GSDR is positive. GSDR is not, although it always happens at the sidelines of G20, its results are not directly embraced. But part of also what we want is to have first analyze the lessons learned till now from the common framework. See this year have a common understanding and if possible, more clear timelines for countries to get that treatment, and also put on the table other mechanisms for to address liquidity pressures. We are also tabling issues, for example, debt swaps, which are not, let's say, a solution for, for the global debt problem, but they are one more contribution. They could be one more contribution, especially linked to some to sustainable development or climate or hunger. So we are tabling this issue for discussion.
So let me touch another point that you mentioned before, financing for development and financing for the low carbon transition. Well, the amounts needed are huge, and it's very hard to identify where they are coming from exactly. But there's a certainty that creativity is also needed. We will need resources that coming from countries themselves, coming from multilateral institutions, coming from blended resources, coming from the private sector, the multilateral institutions mobilizing these resources. I think this is a huge task as well. But I have seen recently your team very much focused on the idea of guaranteeing access to the funds that already exist, such as the GEF or the Climate Investment Fund or the Green Climate Fund and all that. So one thing is the macro scenario, the big amount of resources and the creativity needed. The other is to facilitate access to concessional resources that are already there. What would you have to say?
Yes, no, that's right. Let me say first that as part of our activity in the Secretariat for International Affairs, we are the national authority, for example, the designator for GCF. We work together with also other ministries in GF. We are at the boards of the climate investment funds. We are also working with the adaptation fund. So we handled the topic of in the Ministry of Finance of green finance and the green multilateral funds. So that's also one reason for us to be concerned with that. But in this domain, like you pointed out, we have to pull all levers, right? So the issue of the independent review of the multilateral climate funds is an issue that's interesting because for me, and this is the reason I push very much it also on the agenda, because it gets us together. It gets recipient countries and donors together. And I think it's important that when we have, an understanding and common ground, it's important for us to push it. It's a mature issue. We are also working already together with the funds. They have announced support for this independent review at COP28 in Dubai. I myself took part in a few meetings of the funds where they announced support. So access is it's important for the funds, because you see, actually they embody some of our very high expectations. They were created like the GF after, Rio 92, or the GCF after Paris, and they were supposed to be very large, if not contributors in terms of the amount, but really to help us leverage and move skies in terms of environmental protection and also climate change. Now it's the same for adaptation. And what we see is that this is, not only the amounts are small, but also that access, when you have, sometimes you have even resources there, but access is difficult. So I think it's an important issue, because also we can have some, hopefully, early harvest from that, and this will help push other issues. Now, on the mobilization, the massive mobilization of resources, and taking into account that we have to pull all levers, we in the sustainable finance working group, which is let's say the locus in the finance track, where we talk about the mobilization of private resources and how to complement public and official resources. We have an agenda that also focuses on blended finance. We'd like to come up with models that could be replicated in blended finance. And I'm not talking here only about, philanthropies plus something. We can talk here of blended finance in also big sense, how also to do blended finance, having the multilateral development banks, public and national public banks. For this reason, we are also working in the finance track with the financing commons and having an agenda that is broader than the multilateral development banks. Finally, not to be missed, we to leverage the private sector, we really need with this appropriate risk sharing and sometimes risk mitigation mechanisms. But we also we need the right regulatory for that. And so the work that has been, developed by the central banks, also by FSB, and by other regulators domestic, it's really important. In the side of specifically for Brazil, we have the National Treasury and the minister under the leadership of Minister Haddad has announced last week, together with the first G20 ministerial, a hedging mechanism, a foreign exchange risk mitigation mechanism that will allow us to bring more of long-term financing for private sector investments in the ecological transformation plan and in activities for decarbonization in Brazil. We think this is a concrete proposal that is important also for other emerging markets and developing economies, and amenable to be replicated. We have announced it, our treasury is putting it in place. We have partnerships with the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank for that. And the idea there is not only allow the swaps to be undertaken in the longer term, not only up to 1 year. So the central bank could do swaps with a longer term, also setting the stage for the private sector, for the curve for the private sector, but also that we will have specific financing conditions for projects that are in the category of projects to be incentivized in the ecological transformation plan.
That's great. Risk is no doubt a central issue. But let's talk about the reform of the international multilateral financial institutions. There seems to be consensus that the reforms are needed. The problem is to define which steps should be taken. What's the first step and how to proceed? I've heard you talking about the roadmap for better, bigger, and more effective institutions. How do you see this topic being dealt with by the G20 during the Brazilian presidency?
So we have proposed the implementation of this roadmap for better, bigger, and more effective MDBs because it results directly from a leader's mandate in Delhi, the Delhi Declaration. If we look there, this is a mandate from the leaders. And we think there we have very solid pillars to build, our work upon along the year. So what we are proposing to build the roadmap in the following manner. We have invited the MDBs to work with us. So it's not a G20, in any form. It's not proposed to be something that will be G20 mandating, MDBs directly. Although, of course, we know that the ministers of finance will be at the boards of MDBs, and this will be, the channel through which many things will happen. But we would like to work together with the MDBs, and in particular, we are working with the group of heads of MDBs, which is led this year by the Inter-American Development Bank. So this is one feature. We have invited MDBs to be part of the effort, to share their ideas of what they are doing and be part of the construction of the roadmap. Then the second thing is we have within the International Financial Architecture Working Group, we have created dedicated sessions for MDBs. In these dedicated sessions, we have either the IFA experts from capitals, or we have also asked capitals to designate MDBs experts. Could be, either the ones that are in IFA already, or other officials that do only with MDBs. And in these dedicated sessions, we also have all the MDBs participating. Not only like the dialogues, not only with heads of the MDBs, but we have all the MDBs, and by the way, also some of the funds participating. And so what we are proposing to do is to build a roadmap along the three pillars. So the first pillar for better MDBs, we want to highlight country ownership of programs. We would like to see country platforms and programs that are connected to sustainable development strategies, to decarbonization strategy, to transformation strategies. And we think this would be better done through platforms and programs rather than projects in individual ways. But the better is also a locus to talk about operational reform. And this is already something that is going on. So if you look at the process of reform in the World Bank, the evolution process, one of the pillars is operational reform. There we also want to see, faster and easier access. We want to see also MDBs working as a system. Other operational issues, for example, the issue of using local currencies, foreign exchange risk mitigation. So lots of improvements that we can gain on the operational side to have better MDBs. On the bigger side, we are working with first the legacy, the good legacy that has been built in the G20 with the capital adequacy framework since the Italian presidency, and with the milestones also in Indonesia and in the G20 presidency, where we have now the recommendations of G20 for the implementation of that. So we know that CAF is a lot about doing things better, using the same, focusing on balance sheet optimization to do, do things better with the same amount of money. We think this is very important, and there are different mechanisms or different recommendations of the CAF process. For example, increasing risk appetite of multilateral development banks, working on callable capital, deepening the dialogue with the credit rating agencies, which will also help MDBs also push for changing risk, increase their risk appetite. Some financial innovations, better use of guarantees, for example, better use of guarantees, better use of some of the of other innovations, such as, for example, hybrid capital. So CAF is part of it. Then there is also the issue of bigger in terms of having the right or the adequate amount of capital, right, to be able to leverage the amounts of money, the huge amount of money that we need to mobilize, and MDBs could be a very central element of that. And then there are banks that do not need capitalization now or for the next 5 or 10 years. Other banks may need, other banks may need this capitalization. We also want to bring this issue to the table. The independent expert group that was commissioned by India highlighted a bold agenda for that in terms of tripling the capital available, both concession and no concessional. So this is something to be discussed. We want to discuss these recommendations in G20 and have a general guidance be part of this roadmap. And on the effective side, we want to bring to the table more discussions of development effectiveness, looking at MDBs as a system. Are we measuring correctly what we need, the results that we are seeking, right? And the way, in terms of procedures, the way we're doing is that in each meeting of these along the year of the IFA working group, we are going to bring draft reports for each of these pillars so that we bring together. And in the end of the year, by the last ministerial, we could approve a roadmap that is rather, more general with general guidance, but that will stem from this discussion on, operation, financing, and development effectiveness.
Thank you. Well, we don't have much time, but let me ask the last question about trade. We had a discussion on trade this morning, and I think there's a general understanding that the economics of trade has been replaced by the notion of security. And this has an impact on national policies, more protectionist than before. This also has an impact on global value chains. And in a moment when the muscles of the WTO do not seem to be enough strong to deal with this topic. How do you see the development of the discussion on trade?
So thank you for the opportunity to talk about that, because actually in the finance track, although I think trade is part of it's both a challenge and a solution for many of the things and the growth that we want and the resilient value chains that we want. It's not something that is so much, a core of the agenda. You'd see that even the reforms of WTO are mentioned in our chair summary. And this was also a great language, by the way, that we supported the 13th ministerial. But we are very aware and conscious that how important the trade discussion is for some of the issues that we are discussing, mainly in the framework working group, issues of discussing the transition, the path for transition and sustainable development, how this will impact inequalities both within countries and among countries. This has a lot to do also with trade and with our capacity to renew momentum for trade and to avoid that the answers or the proposals of different countries at the national level, they don't turn out to be actually barriers for other countries, right? I think that is something that we bring into the discussions, that we must keep, we must, and this here to refer to something that Minister Haddad has been highlighting himself, which is a new or a re-globalization along social and environmental lines. So, and this means that trade and open trade should continue to be a feature for that. So we are bringing this issue to the discussions, especially in the framework working group, and also at the sidelines of our July ministerial. We would like to, there is a trade working group in the Sherpas track, right? So we don't have a trade working group in the finance track. It's not traditional that we would have, but we are trying to frame the issue in the way I just mentioned, because we think it's so important. But I hope that in the future we can focus more on this.
Thank you very much. Well, your final remarks. Is there any point that you would like to make that was not covered by my questions or your previous comments?
Perhaps that, we just our general assessment of the first ministerial was we were very satisfied with the results we had. I see a lot of media coverage that focuses on the fact that we didn't have a communiqué, that we have a chair summary. And we are, actually, we think that I think I mentioned this also in some public interview before, that our chair summary is 99% consensual. So we have worked to the end for a consensus, and we feel that we have built together with the group a good momentum, a good start for our discussions, and we will continue now in the next there is a next batch of meetings, of working group meetings now in March and also the beginning of April. It's very much, we would like also to continue this dialogue with the think tanks, with civil society. So I would encourage you to, work on the recommendations. We would like them to see. I know there are so many actually papers that I think have been commissioned for T20. So I'm not sure we'll be able to read. I think it's over 200, right? I'm not sure, but there are so many. We are looking forward to have, if you could, I think something that would be very useful for us is to have from T20 some very objective recommendations that would stem, from the papers and the discussions that you have. So I hope to have the opportunity to interact with you again in the future.
Well, thank you very much for this recommendation. We'll take it into account. And thank you very much for helping us to navigate under these complex waters of the financial track of the G20. Good luck for you. Good luck for Brazil during the 2024 year. And thank you, everyone. Well, let me hand it over to Almir back.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Tatiana Rosito, Ambassador Marcos Caramuru, for such an enlightening conversation that has enabled us better to understand the priorities and agenda of the G20 Brasil finance track. We, the T20 Brazil team, wish all the best luck for you, Ambassador Rosito, in your leadership of this finance track. Now I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Ana Célia Castro, Director of the Brazilian College of Advanced Studies at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, asking for her remarks and moderation of the T20 Brazil Advisory Council's Secretariat panel, in which members of the Secretariat of both councils will present their views. Remember that in this sequence, we have the 25-minute comments and Q&A sessions with other council members and the audience, also conducted by the moderator. Dr. Ana Célia Castro, you have the floor.
Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to be here. It's an honor, a privilege, and I want to thank all the organizers for this opportunity. I intend to answer, I received some questions to enlighten this introduction, but I intend to answer only some of the guiding questions proposed to International National Advisory Council Secretariat, because 5 minutes will not be enough. Still, I suggest the possible lines of thought for the T20 Brasil contributions. And these lines could be summarized as follows. First one, continuity, cohesion, and cooperation. The second one, call for action. And the third one, G20 futures, including other institutions of global governance. And I will not have time to describe them adequately. But I insist that the future perspective is fundamental. It's not a scenario exercise, neither a foresight in a certain sense possible foreseen, but it is a perspective or a vision of what would be the desirable tomorrows and how to anticipate them and avoid dystopic horizons. So every T20 engagement group, such as the G20 engagement group, such as the T20, and even the working groups at the Sharper Trial have a long evolutionary history from the first G20 editions. The T20 started in 2012 and added new themes and sub-themes in every new G20 edition. A comprehensive G20 history of ideas would contribute to divulging and fostering good initiatives coming from G20 and T20 recommendations. I can make an example with one working group, which is also part of the T20 task force concern. How to make task forces work for people, meaning how to derive a call for action from T20 communique with the result of all task forces recommendations. I will use the example of the G20 Health Working Group in G20 that was established under the German presidency in 2017 to enhance dialogue and inform G20 leaders on crucial global health issues. The One Health approach, digital health, university health coverage, international health regulations, compliance, and sustainable finance were discussed. It's tough to deal with such a broad health dimension, especially if we introduce the planet's health. The only possibility to make it affordable is to define mission-oriented policies. The call for action is context-specific. It depends on a financial background, mainly blended finance, the political coalition of interests, and the capacity and capabilities to implement them. Defining mission-oriented policies can contribute to implementation of broad initiatives. A second example could be mentioned is the Zero Net Cities mission. The European Union claimed to be net zero in 2050, and will have 100 net zero cities in the 2030. And it's important because it's more feasible to treat all of the different stages to achieve a net zero city, and also to have all the metrics necessary to follow the accomplishment of the task. So the second point is what experiences from previous T20 editions can I share with T20 Brasil? In addition to the SEPA track, I want to mention the following initiatives from the T20 India that I think that are very important. I cannot see any follow-up until now, and maybe it exists, but I really don't know. The first one is the Research and Innovation Initiative Gathering, which aims to enhance, intensify, and strengthen research and innovation collaboration among G20 member countries. This initiative continues the work of the Academic Forum held during the Italian presidency in 2021, bringing together experts in science, technology, and innovation from G20 members countries. There is another initiative that is G20 CSRAR, Chief Science Advisors Roundtable, a new initiative launched during the India's presidency of the G20. This G20 XR will bring together the chief scientific advisors of the G20 heads of state government to create an effective institutional arrangement platform to discuss global science technology policy issues, which can evolve into an effective and coherent global scientific advisory mechanism. In addition to G20, CARS aims to solve some of the problems facing the global S&T ecosystem. Prioritize areas of the XR during the G20 India's presidency include One Health and all the consequences of the One Health taken seriously. Stating shared scientific infrastructure for the global good and collaboration on emerging and futurist technologies and evolving standards. So how I see the advisory councils contributing to the T20 Brasil process henceforth? I would say that T20 started in 2012 and serves as a think tank for the G20, kind of a bank of ideas, bringing together think tanks and high-level experts to discuss relevant international socioeconomic issues. The T20 recommendations are synthesized into policy briefs and presented to G20 working groups, ministerial meetings, and leaders to help the G20 deliver concrete policy measures. The most important advisory council's contribution, as I see, could be to translate these recommendations into policy-oriented lines of action to be discussed by the stakeholders at different geographical and political levels, as municipalities, states, and federal government level. On the other hand, the connection between the engagement groups is not easily, we cannot see them. So clarifying the governance structure of G20 engagement groups and enhancing their interconnectivity could significantly benefit from advisory council's involvement. So this is my contribution. I think that one is, I come back to the three lines, the three lines that I mentioned at the beginning. Continuity, cohesion, and cooperation. Second, call for action. And third, G20 futures, including other institutions of global governance. I think there's three lines, including the interconnectivity between the engagement forces, would be an important contribution that our advisory council secretariats, the national and international, could contribute to the G20 discussions and implementation of policy orientation. So this is my contribution. I want now to give the floor to the 5 persons that will interact, it's 5, yes, with us, and 5 outstanding contributions to this debate. The first one is Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, which we have the pleasure to hear yesterday. She is the South African Institute of International Affairs, South Africa, and is the chief executive of South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg. Ms. Sidiropoulos serves on the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on the Future of Regional Organizations and the WEF Think Tank Leaders Forum. And until recently, she also served as International Advisory Board of European Union Development Commissioner
Her research focuses in South Africa's foreign policy, global governance, and the role of emerging powers in Africa. Please, Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Anna. Thank you very much for, I think, those very inspiring introductory remarks on continuity, cohesion, cooperation, call for action, and G20 futures. On the G20 futures, I think that's actually a critical element that we should actually very much take on board in terms of imagining the future we would like and how we can anticipate that. So I would agree with those points. I think you also raised, if I may, before I go on to my remarks, I think a very important observation around mission-oriented policies. And I think that's been also a focus and consideration in other fora. I think most notably some of the conversations that we've had in various UN fora. It's an idea that also the economist Mariana Mazzucato has been arguing for, and I think she recently wrote a paper for the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs on mission-oriented multilateral development banks, what we were obviously also discussing in the previous session. But let me make some remarks on those three questions that we were tasked with sort of putting our heads together on. And the first one really relates to the theme of what themes are imperative for the G20 and the T20 process. Certainly coming from a developing country, coming from a country specifically like South Africa, where the issue of inequality is very dominant, the way in which Brazil has positioned its presidency, focusing on inequality, on poverty and hunger, I think it resonates in my country and resonates, I would argue, across the African continent. What is obviously always important, and this is also part of the consideration that we are having here in South Africa as we prepare for our own presidency next year, is that the G20 provides a unique platform that brings together the North and the South to really think about how we improve, reform, revolutionize the global system in a way that actually helps everybody. So the priorities clearly have to be transformative. The actions, the recommendations have to have that as their central pillar, and it has to be about development. It has to be about well-being. I think that's critical. That is critical. I think during the course of this morning, at least in Brazil, I think the points that people like Vera made was that we need to be making paradigm shifts, because the environment that we're living in is characterized by more frequent and interlocking systemic shocks. And so the rules that we've had in place don't work. And that's where the G20 can play such a critical role, if it is allowed to. And I'll get to that just now. I think a couple of issues that are important to reiterate on the G20 agenda. Social development cannot be an afterthought. You know, we obviously always talk across both G20 tracks about the importance of inclusive economic growth, but inclusive, we forget sometimes, inclusive means that policies need to cohere with a social agenda. It is not that the economics and the social go hand in hand. You can't be thinking about what is good for the economics without actually considering the consequences and impact on the social. And relatedly, of course, another C to add to your first three C's, Anna, is that of a contract, and a social contract. And what we've seen, I think, happen over the last several years is a complete collapse of the social contract. And at the core of that lies really the importance of rebuilding trust. And we all know that rebuilding trust is such a long process. But the start can actually happen today. It can happen in Brazil, because there are a number of interventions, a number of what I like to call low-hanging fruit that if there is political will, can actually begin to rebuild the trust on both sides of the divide. And unfortunately, the divide these days is very much about north-south. And so that is, I think, when we're thinking about priorities, that's important. What are those low-hanging fruit? And I think over the course of today and yesterday, there were a couple of points put on the table. I would argue, and maybe these may not, some may argue these are not easy wins, but some of the concepts around concessionality and who is eligible and who isn't. The issue of SDRs. There are regulatory barriers to being able to deploy the SDRs, for example, through regional development banks, but we can change them. We can change those regulations to enable it. A fairly, I would think, not as expensive an option as some other options might be. I think there is also the issue of let's not forget IDA replenishment this year, the International Development Association, the replenishment. I think that's important, and that we can really drive and focus on. And then, of course, when we're talking about debt, which I see as a longer term challenge, let's put equity and fairness at the center of that. And I think some of the thinking certainly coming out of the developing world is very much that. The other point I want to make is that we're wanting to accelerate the SDGs across at the global and also at the national level. What I think sometimes we ignore or we forget, and sometimes it may be unintended, is the negative spillovers of actions taken in one locality in order to address and in order to meet the SDGs or to move in that direction, which has significantly negative consequences for others in other regions. And I think there's a wonderful index that has been developed on negative spillovers on SDGs, which I think is important to refer to. And then two last points on that. The one is gender. In some work that we did recently at the Institute that looked at African macroeconomic resilience and gender inclusion, we found that actually gender inclusion, much more than any of the other indicators, actually was a core element of countering social vulnerability. So that speaks to the issues of women's empowerment, which we also spoke about earlier. And lastly, in that, in terms of the importance of certain themes, is I think standards. We heard about them today. We were discussing them a little bit yesterday. These are essential to enabling or inhibiting our attainment of the SDGs. And I think sometimes people say these are unintended, but I think in a heightened geopolitically fragmented world, one can certainly be a little cynical and skeptical about that. Anna, I've got a couple of other suggestions. Can I proceed? Do I have a little bit of time? I've got a couple more suggestions on experiences from previous T20 and
yes, please.
I think just to add to I think the really good suggestions you have made, and reflecting also on what Ambassador Rosito said just now. I think we're producing, and every year we produce a significant number of policy briefings. I think they're always excellent. They touch on all of the critical issues that are on the agenda and some of the issues that are not on the agenda. But policymakers don't necessarily read them. And that's a challenge that we as think tankers always have to face. So it's also important to engage with the various tracks during the course of the T20 process. And I think this is certainly something that T20 Brazil and I think previously T20 India also has taken to heart. And I think what is really positive about the T20 process this year is, of course, that we are trying to end it quite soon in June, so that before the writing, the initial drafting of the declaration begins, some of these can actually filter through into that. One other thing I've raised before, which is something to consider, but we never have time, is that we move on. Every year we produce hundreds of policy briefings and then we move on. But there are actually some really excellent work that's been done there. You know, I'd like to be able to sort of give it to a young researcher at the Institute to actually go through and identify, you know, these are 5 excellent recommendations that have been made over the course of the last 5 years that should be fed into the process this year, because maybe their time is now. Sometimes you make recommendations and it's too early for people to really consider them. Then a couple of other points in terms of the policy briefings themselves. I think let's always bear in mind as we write them, the SMART. The recommendations have to be specific, they have to be measurable, they have to be achievable, they have to be relevant, and they have to be time bound. I think it would be true to say that if you do an analysis of some of the declarations themselves, they don't always follow the SMART either. But let's, to the extent possible as think tankers, let's try to aim to do that, because that then gives the policymakers something really, really concrete. And then lastly, on the International Advisory Board Council and how we should then take all of this very rich material that is coming out of the policy briefings and putting it out into the more formal policy making. I think what really will be essential is to identify and synthesize the key recommendations, the big ideas, the big transformative ideas that we want to put on the table in front of the policymakers in a way that is pithy and short, and that they can't say, oh my word, this is far too complicated, or, you know, what exactly do you want me to do with this? I think that if we can achieve that as a national and international advisory council working with the T20 Brazil, I think that would be a huge, that would be an A+ for me. And to also then in that context explore and highlight what might be easy wins and what might require us to start working on these things now, but might take a bit longer to realize. And building on what Brazil did, which I think was really excellent in December, which was to bring together the finance and the Sherpa track into one room, because there is so many interlinkages. I think the central messages that we seek to put out there, I think it's important for those cross linkages to be apparent, because sometimes something is in the Sherpa track and it requires money, and it's not in the finance track, and it means it doesn't have legs. So I'm going to leave it there. There's also some ideas around youth, but I'll pick that up in the discussions in the Q&A session. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you. It's remarkable, the expertise and your experience in the previous G20. So I couldn't agree more with all of your observations. And I want to emphasize the necessary rebuilding of the social contracts, and also rebuilding trust. And maybe we could suggest, and Brazil has really experience on this, is to make social policies universal. So because this is going to make a huge difference. So I need to give the floor. I totally agree with you. It's really, all observations were really fantastic. But I want to give the floor to Professor Bambang Brojonegoro. I don't see if I'm spelling correctly. Who is from University of Indonesia, has a Bachelor of Economics, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign Master in Urban Planning, and PhD in the same field, Urban and Regional Planning. Has been Dean of his university in 2005, Minister of Finance 2014 to 2016, Minister of National Development Planning, Head of the National Development Planning Agency from 2016 to 2019, and Minister of Research and Technology, Head of Research and Innovation Agency, National Agency, from 2019 to 2021. Please, the floor is yours, and please correct my pronunciation of your name. So I'm sorry if I did it wrongly. Please, Professor Bambang. Please, the floor is yours.
Dear Professor Ana Célia, Professor Bamban is finishing teaching a class and will be joining us as soon as possible.
Okay, so let's move to Janvi Tripathi. It's here. Is coordinator of Think Tank India Secretariat and associate fellow with ORF Geoeconomic Studies Program. Her research includes international trade policy issues, digital trade policy, gender and trade, and WTO reform and standards. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth is always a hard act to follow. And I had that experience when I interacted with her last year during the Think 20. So I should have prepared myself better, but here we are. Thank you for the kind introduction. As mentioned, I was coordinator for Think 20 India, as well as the Think 20 Task Force on Trade last year. And this year I have the privilege of being part of the International Advisory Council Secretariat. I would echo the thoughts of both Anna and Elizabeth in terms of the need for continuity. And that is something the Indian presidency definitely is flattered to see continued in Think 20 India, as well as Think 20 Brazil, as well as in the G20 priorities that we see. What Brazil has done better is the efficiency with which they've been able to reduce the number of task forces to 6 and actually streamline the kind of discussions we are having on the diverse issues. But I think what is pivotal and something that came out in the speech of the Sherpa yesterday and in the conversation today with finance track individuals was the need for reforming global governance if we are to achieve any of the grand goals we keep setting for each other. As we know, we're far off the mark for 2030. We are far off the mark for about 70% of the SDGs, and it can be disheartening being located in the global south and constantly blamed for emissions, for all the wrongs in society, perhaps from poverty, inequality, without the OECD countries sort of self-reflecting and sort of denying culpability for failure of international institutions. We are all members of the international community and all members of global governance institutions. We are all responsible collectively for their achievements and failures. So I think to get more substantive reform ideas should be a focus for all of the task forces that we are seeing. And it is something we saw in Think 20 India as well, where we really tried to ensure that from the policy briefs to the task force statements to the Think 20 communique, we were coming out with specific recommendations directed to a specific Sherpa track or finance track working group. So some things that the community here could keep in mind as they go through their policy briefs, as they start writing their task force statements, and eventually contribute to the Think 20 communique. One of the things that I would like to highlight is the new assertiveness that the Global South has been able to come up with starting from the Indonesian presidency, which was a decidedly difficult one, up to India, Brazil, and eventually South Africa. We have been able to subvert the negative connotations that the term Global South came with. And we've been able to say, well, you call us the Global South, but we are about 80% of the voices of the world. So it's about time you listen to us. Thirdly, my submission would be to increase our communication with the African Union. They are our new member. They are a significant part of how the G20 can reform itself and make itself more reflective of world realities. And they are also an important part of what our future will look like. So G20 futures will not be complete until we are hearing voices more from the African continent and more Latin American countries, in fact. So on that would be on the thematic side of things, my submission. On what are the key things that we can do as the International Advisory Council and National Advisory Council, I agree again with Elizabeth that, you know, bringing those ideas together, cutting the noise, getting to the very smart recommendations that are easily picked up and easily understood, and maybe say in 8 words what is being said in 80 words. That will have to be the goal, and we will of course be guided by issues that are discussed in these 3 days, as well as the policy briefs and statements. But I would also like to highlight here that one of the things that came out in discussions was that a lot of the subgroups within task forces are talking about similar issues, but from a different perspective. So the financial task force could be talking about IMF reform, while the trade task force is talking about WTO reform, but they're talking about global governance reform from their respective focal points. There might be similarities, and there might be similar recommendations or approaches to reform that could be useful. So I think internally we would have to see how to make sure that we're not creating echo chambers, but instead very much creating a conversation that is more symbiotic and more cohesive, so that our recommendations are more useful for the Sherpa and Finance track in the track 1. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. It's also a privilege to have your experience on G20 and T20. And actually, we do have our two countries together, no? India, Brazil, and South Africa. So it's really remarkable to be able to construct from this history, to give a cohesion from the recent past and think about the future. So let me give the floor to Lara Stahlberg, if Professor Bambang is not yet here, is here. No, so please, Lara Stahlberg. Lara is a strategic communication consultant with experience in print and digital content production, public relations, and media training. She holds a master's degree in Brazil in Global Perspective from King's College, London, and a master's degree in Social Anthropology from Federal University of São Carlos. She is also a researcher at the Department of Public Policy Analysis at Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Please, Lara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ana Célia. Thank you, colleagues. Good morning, afternoon, or evening for all of you across the globe. Thank you for the organizing committee for putting again another challenging cross-cutting session for the T20, especially Ambassador Marcia, Luciana, both Lucianas and the whole SEBRI, IPEA, and FUNAG teams for your support through and facilitation throughout this whole process. And of course, thank you to Ana Célia, not only for mediating our session, but also for the work within the Secretariat. Well, I'm following two very tough acts, and especially two very experienced women, not only within the T20 and the G20. So I'm going to try not to repeat myself too much, if I may. It's especially heartwarming both to follow women in these positions, and also to hear the smart word. So think about actionable, time-bound objectives is very heartwarming for us. Today I'm representing Ilona Szabo, who is the co-founder and president of Instituto Igarapé, to whom I'm chief of staff. Here at Igarapé, we are a think and do tank with a very global footprint, operating from Rio and São Paulo. So over the years, where our experience has been geared towards is exactly the engagement in global governance discussion, particularly in response to some of the milestones and the UN processes and so on. So on that sense, so what we believe our contribution can be here is to build on the insights gleaned from various contributions that we already have to multilateral processes, such as our common agenda or the UNSG's high-level advisory board on multilateralism. And we see that as a unique opportunity for other major global processes, namely not only the G and T20, but all the processes for the Summit of the Future, the COPs and the BRICS as well. So we believe the steering way we see the processes of the G20 is this openness to actually make sure that the processes are not echo chambers themselves, but also so to make sure that we can leapfrog into the actionable solutions that the world so desperately wants and needs. So recognizing these systemic risks that we're facing for both people and planet, we're taking our position not only in within the advisory council, but also leading the task force on multilateralism and global governance to advocate for a more inclusive and network multilateralism to navigate these challenges effectively. So from our mandate in Task Force 6 to strengthen global governance, to the T20 more broadly, in terms of the 3 pillars that the Brazilian presidency of the G20 has stated, I believe that so far that our work within the T20 has been doing a great job to make sure that these fall within the 3 major pillars and categories. This will actually make it easier for our recommendations to be more actionable and actually be heard from the policymakers, not only from the Brazil presidency, but also for the leaders more broadly. And I think our role in this sense is to make sure from a National Advisory Council perspective, and this is where Professor Ana Célia plays an even more pivotal role, is as an opportunity for the Brazilian and academic research communities to actually make sure that they actively contribute to global governance discussion, to leveraging their expertise to shape policy recommendations and influence decision-making processes. This could be a very enriching process for Brazilian academics who haven't had that opportunity before. So I believe that this is part of the work that we have to aim towards as well. So not only to make sure that the policies achieve, but also for capacity building and enhancing within our own Brazilian academic and think tank ecosystem. So by actively engaging in these processes, we can make sure that the advisory councils can encompass a diverse expertise and diverse perspective to provide these insights and enhance and enrich the deliberative processes and make sure that the task forces are comprehensive, evidence-based, actionable, and also trying to address especially the blind spots in themes that may not be so thoroughly addressed within the task force or the subgroups. This is a very fine-tuning process in our view. It's how do we make sure that it's not too broad, but exactly broad enough to make sure that the most urgent themes are being addressed. But I believe that as an advisory council, this is part of the challenge that we have to address, as well as facilitating the processes, as Jambi so beautifully put, to make sure that we are not echo chambers within echo chambers, and make sure that the task forces are conversing and converging. I do not want to extend myself, but just want to express our commitment to fostering this more effective and legitimate and even accountable global governance systems. I think we have a wealth of inputs and brilliant contributions to be made within this process. So we firmly believe that we do have the power and the strength to make actionable suggestions and changes. So I'm looking forward to continuing this processes and collaborating with you. Again, as we mentioned within the advisory council meetings, I want to make sure that not only people from the participants of our task force, but of all task forces and the advisory council overall, feel free to approach us, make sure that we are reachable, and we can make sure that your contributions are reaching the ears that they are meant to. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. I want to pick up 2 points of what you have just said. One is make sense of leapfrogging, to assure that the Brazilian experience will leapfrog, and there is a continuity, but also aggregation of new objectives. So first one, make sure to amplify the ecosystem for discussion, including the academics, and also give them the opportunity to contribute to all these discussions that we are having at the T20. So thank you very much. Now I can see that Professor Bambang is here, and I would like to announce him. He is from University of Indonesia. He has a Bachelor of Economics, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Master in Urban Planning, and PhD in the same field, Urban and Regional Planning. He has been Dean of his university in 2005, Minister of Finance in 2014 to 2016, Minister of National Development Planning, Head of the National Development Planning Agency from 2016 to 2019, and Minister of Research and Technology, Head of Research and Innovation Agency National, 2019 to 2021. Professor Bambang, the floor is yours. I'm sorry if I did not pronounce your surname, so please do it for me. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Castro, for a nice introduction. So apologize that I joined this event a little bit late. So let me try to highlight the point as a former T20 chair for Indonesia 2022, and also participating, of course, as International Advisory Council for T20 India. First, of course, I like to see, of course, the continuation from the previous T20 to the current T20 of Brazil. And certainly the theme of the T20 process in Brazil, as well as G20, should reflect what has been done so far in the previous G20, T20, not only in India, Indonesia, but also before that. I think in general, one of the critical topics that needs to be strengthened in the T20 Brazil is so-called the deadline of the SDG 2030. We know that we already have so-called the global goal, Sustainable Development Goals. And we know that so-called the deadline of the SDG is 2030. And we know we are way behind. But of course, there is no excuse, and we have to try our best to make sure that the deadline at least might not be fulfilled, 100%, but at least we can do a lot of improvement during the rest of the 6 years. So under the umbrella of the SDG, I believe there are few topics that needs to be the focus of the T20 Brazil. Number one, of course, still the issue of climate change and sustainable development, with the emphasis on how to reduce the fossil fuel, especially coal, oil, and gas. And then we have to be concerned with the fact that those type of fossil fuel produce majority of greenhouse gas emission as well as carbon dioxide. And then the issue of global economic recovery. Yes, of course, after COVID, we have seen the recovery all over the world. But now we have the issue, for example, high inflation in developed countries that leads to the high interest rate. In the regime of high interest rate, then of course, many developing nations, emerging economies, suffer because of this high interest rate regime. And of course, we need to find a way to promote economic growth while waiting for the advanced economy, especially the US, to start reducing their interest rate. But at the same time, of course, we expect that global inflation could be at the lower level compared to the previous years. On the third aspect, I believe I would emphasize on technological advancement and governance. I think we need to balance the benefits of technological innovation, including now the artificial intelligence that has been the talk of the town. And we need to balance that type of AI development with responsible development and ethical consideration. And of course, we don't want the technological advancement will be at the cost of our life quality. And then another issue would be food security. I believe is still critical given the fact that climate change has some effect on the El Nino, for example, that reduce at least or affect negatively the food production, especially on the Asian side. The rice production has been quite limited due to this El Nino phenomena. And then last but not least, we need to make sure multilateralism and global cooperation still in the front. Because the reason why we are together here is we would like to have better collaboration, and it's not just bilateral, but more importantly, multilateral. And of course, I like to see the G20 as the forum in which developed countries really wants other member of G20 categorized as emerging economies to be at the same level with the developed economy. So far, in my experience, both as ministers dealing with the G20 and also as a think tank at T20, I haven't seen a serious effort from the developed economy to really bring the emerging economies like Indonesia, Brazil, India to be closer to the developed economies like in the northern part of America as well as western side of Europe. So I believe maybe this is the beginning of my intervention. And again, thank you very much for including me in this International Advisory Council of the T20 Brasil.
It's also remarkable your experience in the previous G20 and T20 rounds. So we appreciate very much your point of the taking into account the deadline for the SDGs. So it's really an important point that should be recovered from at the end of the discussion. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Mayara Poli from CIPOR Initiative. She is the Executive Director and co-founder of Plataforma CIPOR and specialist in international relations and public policies. She leads and participates in research projects and advocacy initiatives in climate, environment crimes, peace and security, global governance, and foreign policy. And please, Mayara, without much ado, I give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana Célia, and thank you. I would like first to start by thanking the organizing committee for the invitation for this Inception Conference, but also for all the work that SEBRE, FUNAG, and IPEA have been putting into this T20 process. As Ana Célia has mentioned, I am Mayara Poli. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Plataforma CIPOR. For those who don't know, CIPOR works on the intersections between climate change, sustainable development, global governance, and foreign policy. Our main mission is to work towards placing the sustainability agenda at the core of Brazil's foreign policy, but also at the core of the international forums that the country is part of. So that, of course, includes the G20, but also the BRICS, the United Nations, among others. And in the context of the T20 specifically, CIPO has been tasked by the organizing committee to co-lead task force number 2, so sustainable climate action and inclusive just energy transition, task that we are honored to carry it out alongside our colleagues from IDRI, which is a French think tank. And we are also part of the International Advisory Board and the National Advisory Board. Within the G20 process specifically, our main work in terms of research, advocacy, and fostering networks and connection has focused primarily on 2 main strategic goals. One, as I mentioned before, is to strengthen the climate agenda within the G20's frameworks and political decisions, but also something that we also try to do is to encourage greater synergies between the G20 and other multilateral processes, especially those dedicated to climate change. I did have initially some presentation that I was going to deliver, but gladly, a lot of the things I was going to say have already been mentioned by my previous colleagues from the T20, but also some representatives from the government. So I will not repeat myself, but I thought of maybe reinforcing a few points, which I think it's important for us to stress as engagement groups, because it's clearly emerged as priority for Brazil. And if we do want to influence this process, I think we need to make sure that what we are doing is also dialoguing with the priorities of the other task forces and working groups of the G20. And so I will touch again upon the issue that has been mentioned today and yesterday a lot, which is the issue of inequality, right? When we consider, everyone is probably tired of hearing that by now, the 3 priorities for Brazil: the fight against poverty and hunger, energy transition, sustainable development, and the reform of global governance. But to me, it's very clear that there is a strong attempt to mainstream inequality as a key policy concern for all of the G20 frameworks. For instance, when we see the discussions around the reform of global governance, the priority has very clearly been on how to enhance the voice and representation of developing countries, in particular, in global decision-making. And this is regarded, in my view, as a precondition to not only improve the efficacy and credibility and accountability of those institutions, but the overall legitimacy of the multilateral system as a whole. And when it comes to our agenda, the CIPO is particularly focused on, which is the climate agenda, tackling inequalities has been put gladly by the presidency as a precondition, again, to promote energy transition and sustainable development across its 3 pillars, right? Social, economic, and environmental. And it's very encouraging to see that this discussion around how to promote the transition to low carbon economies is also taking in consideration the aspect of how to do that while also promoting social justice. So it is touching upon an aspect that has been mentioned here, the importance of continuity. It's interesting to see how, for instance, some of the priorities for the India presidency, such as the reform of the multilateral development bank, so that they are more aligned with the goal of the Paris Agreement. It's promising to see that this priority has been carried out, continued by the Brazilian presidency. I was last week with some of you in this call in São Paulo, in some of the events around the finance track meeting. And it was great to see representatives from the IMF, the International Development Bank, making quite significant announcements in terms of the increase that those banks will do for climate action. It's also good to see a strong focus on how to make access to these funds more simple, less bureaucratic, and the whole discussion on how to provide technical assistance so every country is able to access this fund. But again, these discussions are not new. They've been carried out in previous presidencies. But I think what is standing out again is the issue of inequalities. And if I were to say as an engagement group, something that, you know, we should be following very closely and provide recommendations on, if I were to highlight one aspect, I'd say the discussion of the proposal that Brazil has put forward around a minimal taxation of 2% upon the annual income of the super rich, to complement the already ongoing discussions at the OECD, which seeks to establish a tax rate of 15% on the profits of large multinational companies in every jurisdiction they operate. It was interesting that in his opening remarks, Minister Fernando Haddad opened it with the quote that the richest 1% of the population own 43% of the world's financial assets, while they emit the same amount of carbon as the poorest 2/3 of humanity. So the connections between the inequality and the climate agenda is very clear, but the international community has, as of now, failed to think of solutions that take into these two aspects into account. And I do think that, you know, the Brazilian presidency opens a new period and brings new opportunities to look at those agendas more comprehensively and more systematically. And although we know that the G20 is, each presidency only lasts 1 year, I think, you know, we should always bear in mind the other multilateral process, and some of which the Brazil will also be leading. We all know we have COP30 in Brazil, in Belém, but next year we're also going to have the BRICS summit. It will be the first summit with the expanded BRICS, which now also bring, you know, some of the world's largest economy, but countries which with a lot of political weight. So it would be good for us as engagement groups, in my view, to ensure that our work does not end this year with the G20, that we are able to make sure that the recommendations that we produce by the end of this process is also carried out and useful for the other multilateral discussions that we will see in the coming year. And a final point before I end is, it's something that, you know, I know the organizing committee is trying to do, and we support as well, but I would like to reinforce the importance of us collaborating with the other engagement groups. At CIPO, we are also part of the C20 working group on climate, precisely because we want to know what are discussing that there in the C20 that we can bring to our task force in the T20, but we have the S20, the W20. Last year, we had the opportunity to bring those people together for the first time, but I think we should be doing more of this exercise and hopefully articulate ourselves to come up with a joint declaration that compiles the priorities and the recommendations of the T20 and the other process. So I'm putting myself available there, and I know a lot of the organizations who are part of the National Advisory Council are also engaged with other groups. So count on us to do this work, to help with this work with coordination with other engagement groups. So yes, I think this was the main messages I would like to pass here. And thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Mayara. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Pradip Singh Mehta, if he's still here, because he was trying to talk during this session, and we were not at the moment to give the floor to the audience. But he's a member of International Advisory Council, and I would like to know if he's still here to give him the floor to make his comments. Anyone knows about it? No? So now it's time for our discussion. And I would like to invite Said Altman, because he also makes some interesting comments on the meeting chat. So if you want to talk now, please. And the floor is open to everybody. So we have now our discussion time. And as I could see by the chat, very interesting observations were put in the website, in the meeting chat. So please, the floor is yours. It's to the audience. Okay, Sebastian, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing all this. So I'm Sébastien Treyer. I'm the Executive Director of IDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development International Relations in Paris. And my colleague Céline Kaufmann is co-chairing Task Force 2 with Mayara from SIPO. Two comments from my side. The first one is I'm really interested in the emphasis that Brazil is putting on the issues of social policies. I mean, the way that, I don't remember if it's Ana Celia proposing it like that, but to make social policies universal is something that is really important. I must say that working on the European Union, as a French Paris-based think tank, we already are facing a big problem to try and make social policies more harmonized at the level of the European Union. So I see the big political challenge to try and make that happen at the scale of the whole planet, which is not why we should not try. And I really think there is something very important here, as Mayara has put it, the invitation of Gabriel Zucman at the G20 meeting of finance ministers to put forward the taxation of the super rich was something really important. And I think we should use as much as possible the Brazilian presidency leadership this year, while not being sure that we would obtain a result this year, and see how that can be followed up. So that's something that I'm really interested in seeing how we can push in that direction. Working on environmental issues and sustainability issues as IDRI, we are really interested to see that without those social policies, probably the transition is going to be impossible. So that's something that we really can also complement, analyze, and support. My second point and last point is I was thinking of how we can deliver and really advise the people who will listen to our advice as a T20. I see the point of joining forces with other engagement groups like C20 to gain more legitimacy legitimacy, more constituencies behind us. But generally, what is important in terms of our capacity to convince is that it's really grounded on analysis and that is salient. So that's sometimes not always easy to find the same wordings as the civil society engagement group, etc. So I would, from my side, to some extent resist watering down our proposals because we have to negotiate with other groups when we have a really salient thing to propose, because sometimes the saliency is all we have in terms of being thought leaders. But that's a general principle. The other thing that I think in terms of making a point, we see, I think, the fact that the geopolitical problems are invading, as it has been also the case in the Indonesian presidency, the capacity to get to a common communique. And that's why I was thinking we also, we might need as an international advisory council to think of a way to not just pressure the governments in the G20 setting, but also see how we can get our points in other settings, because if it's complicated to get that into the G20 communique, there might be other instances where we can have our own governments where we are located to subscribe to something. So I have no solution here. I'm just worried that there is a blocking factor in the way that the G20 is producing an output. Thanks for listening to me. I'm really happy to be part of that adventure.
Thank you. Excellent. Elizabeth, would you like to comment on these comments? Before giving, maybe we should give the floor to the other Ana Karina, etc. But maybe you just make a few comments on this because it has a lot to do with what you said.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what Sebastian is saying makes a lot of sense. I think the point about the political difficulties around social policies is absolutely the case. But I think you also said, Sebastian, the fact that it's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And sometimes you've got to start today to realize something much, much later. And I'm sure there's definitely an African proverb about that, but it doesn't come to mind right now. on the engagement groups, I think that's actually a very useful point that you made. Be careful not to dilute the message where you actually end up negotiating text. You know, at the end of the day, think tank shouldn't be negotiating texts with, you know, the value of the think tanks is that we're independent, we can be provocative. I see Vera nodding there, and we don't have to be always politically correct. In fact, we shouldn't be politically correct. And so I think the point that Sebastian makes there is very important. And then of course the other forum. So
Yeah,
I think I'm just agreeing.
Yeah, I agree with you. Anna Katarina Hornidge, please, the floor is yours.
Chair, hi. Thank you, Anna, for giving me the word. I just want to come in with three sort of points and considerations. First, I wanted to mention that I think it's also helpful to reflect on how to, in a way, contribute to this G20 presidency out of the think tank context in order to push for some changes in controversial areas. And I think we probably all agree on this. And I did want to mention supply chain law discussions and also the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which are both, of course, areas where there is quite a bit of controversy, and there's also a lot of potential to in a way, geopoliticize these discussions. But I would see us here in a position where there is a potential to really push for some adjustments, such as by, we think of CBAM, to assure that there is an adjustment of the whole mechanism taking place, that the profits basically are then reinvested into transformational processes of the countries exporting into the EU, for instance. So just want to raise that point, because I think especially also with afforestation-free supply chains, there is quite a strong positioning taking place also within Brazil, and I see a window of opportunity here to also contribute in a meaningful manner for the think tank community. That's my first point. Then I wanted to mention regarding the Agenda 2030, I fully agree that that is a common frame, and that the think tank community is advised well in the current geopolitical situation to again and again remind us of the fact that we indeed have this common framework that is valuable and very valuable. And at the same time, I think it's still too early to really meaningfully engage in a beyond 2030 discussion. So I wasn't here right at the beginning of this conversation, so I might have missed a meaningful part on that point. But to me, it's important that we, on the one side, contribute to reflection on the accelerated implementation of the Agenda 2030 and underline its meaning as a common framework. But on the other side, also give us some time to reflect on a beyond 2030 discussion, and rather invest into sort of building the infrastructures, you could say, or dialogue structures for that discussion to then take place sort of from probably 26 onwards. Just to not divert attention from actually accelerated implementation. And third, just a small point, but some of you might know that there is quite a planning process happening for a Hamburg Sustainability Conference here in Germany, and that is supposed to take place in October, 7th and 8th of October. And food security was lifted up to was identified as one of the big four topics in order to under Brazil's G20 presidency and Brazil's leadership to take the topic of food security forward. And I wonder how we as a think tank community want to engage with that, whether there are already some discussions taking place, or whether we should maybe jointly think about it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Who is next is Javier Gonzalez.
from Mexico.
Thank you, Ana Celia. Yes, very briefly, I just wanted to elaborate on what Elizabeth said about this need that we have to rethink our social contracts and to reinforce trust. Because I was wondering how can we even think about that without making reference to the democracy and rule of law challenges that we are going through. So with this year, and this makes this presidency very special, we have this year more than 70 electoral processes around the world, which involves more than half of the world population, which is a lot. But the thing is that we are witnessing, the need to protect our information environments, for example, from disinformation, misinformation, from hate speech. We are looking throughout the world also attacks on the free press. We are looking, these attacks on the countervailing institution, check and balances. We are witnessing also attacks on civil society organizations, think tanks like us. So this is very important to me because this is a piece of context that is not healthy to ignore. And perhaps throughout the work of the task forces and the subgroups, we should foster a sort of human rights protection perspective, so we can be aware of the threats that we are witnessing throughout the world in terms, for instance, of the emergent technologies and the threats to privacy and the risks to that, for instance, surveillance technologies pose to human rights. So we have another challenges related to the rule of law and democracy, such as these populist temptations that are we are seeing everywhere from the right and from the left, and also the need to improve the participation and representation mechanisms within countries. So this is very important. I know this is not perhaps it's a controversial issue, but I think that we should be at least aware of this piece of context, as I said. Thank you, Anna.
Well, I can't see any hand raised. No? It's okay. Oh, yes, Seth Akman, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Thank you, Anna. It has been very productive for me, actually, to be here in the advisory council, get some views of my colleagues. Just to add something that to build on my question about the effectiveness of T20. I remember a couple of years ago, IDOS published. I participated in the article on how to improve the T20 process and make it more effective, especially in the level of policymakers, because we know that policymakers are very much engaged with their daily things, and I don't know how much time they have to read all these papers. There's an impressive number of very good abstracts I see, but we need to work more on it. And I would like to thank Madeline from Toronto. She shared something about it, and also Elizabeth and her ideas about how to bring the things also at the local and regional level. We also need to have from the in one of the questions you put for this session, I remember our earlier experiences from the T20 processes that we had in previous years. And each time we talk about having a better coordination and alignment with the respective working groups, their schedules, so we can have more contact with the relevant working groups, G20 working groups, and to bring more effectively the views expressed in policy briefs. And sometimes we don't have such a good matching of the schedules. Another thing important is we have so many policy briefs in the previous years, Of course, it is not easy to reflect all the views, but at least some more strong recommendations could be reflected to T20 communique, and which can be delivered to policymakers. And I think we should also promote the G20 working groups. So have a traditional thing to engage with T20 during their meetings, and that would add some specific points from T20 to G20. And I think our advisory council should think of such a coordination between policymakers to increase the effectiveness of what we are doing here, because since many years, we have almost 1,000 policy briefs, and I don't know how many of them have been really utilized by policymakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I collected Hans. Hans, please.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Anastasia. Just one very short comment on this really useful debate that we have. You listed some criteria at the beginning, Anastasia, for the work of the T20 and how we would best sort of shape it for the G20. And there's one criteria I think that should also come through very clearly, and that's urgency. On many of the issues that we're dealing with here, the clock is ticking. And one issue that we've seen in the past in the G20 is that even though they might take up some of these suggestions, the communiques would bring them up, there is often a lack of that sense of urgency. If our work, certainly on areas such as the climate, certainly on areas such as the SDG delivery, could reflect that sense of urgency, I think that would be very helpful.
Excellent. Before giving the floor to the discussants, let me put the main ideas that I could wrap up to the conversation. First one, social contracts, rebuilding trust. Making social policies universal can contribute to social contracts and rebuilding trust. Second, the SDGs. Take into account the deadlines and what need to be achieved, what is missing. Second point. Third, the multilateral global cooperation, the South-South cooperation that we had in this sequence. Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa. Before going to United States, this is our turn. So we really have to profit from this South-South dialogue. 4, the role of integrating the relevant stakeholders in G20, T20 discussions, and the importance of bringing the academia and professors. 4, call for action, urgency, the need of urgency and future perspective. What should be addressed to policymakers? 6, financial architecture to fight inequalities and climate change. 7, assure the democratic context and the rules of law, make institutions work before calling for institutional change. And so this is my own appointments. And then I give the floor to the commission, to the people that presented their observations in the national and international advisory committees, please. Yes, if you want to say something before we end the session. Or even Luciana, Marcia, and who else? Mariana. Please, the floor is yours. Marcos Caramuru is still here. Yes, Vera, you are so quiet now. Please.
Okay.
Make your observations. Instigate us.
I'm here very quiet. Look, I think that yesterday and today we have a very good exchange of ideas. And let's go now to what we have to do, this group, what we are here. We are here to produce policy papers, first to select the policy papers. Now, but we are here to go and make a final report of the task forces. And this is the reason we are discussing. We have first to have a kind of criteria to select the papers now. I agree with everybody. We don't have to have 6,000 of them. Just to select some of them, to publish, to use this, and then to publish the other ones, but choose some of them. Then our report. We have to start. I listened yesterday that we have to do something before July. That we have to have everything done at the end of June. Please correct me the days. And come on, you have to start running to, again, not to make a very soft 100 pages report, to be really short and give ideas out of the boxes, thing that can help the G20 to put some things new. If not, we are going to repeat. Look, we are going to. I said this morning, we are in this disruptive world. Are you going to keep saying the same things? What's going on in WHO is a tragedy. They keep saying the same things, but the members do not want to finish anything. So how about new ideas? And the same thing for the rest. Please, this is my message for the organizers. Right?
Excellent, Vera. I totally agree with you. And I want to give back the floor to Ministro Almir so he can have the final words to close the session, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ana Célia Castro, for conducting this remarkable exchange of views and ideas regarding the work of both national and international advisory council members, and also for the wrap-up. Once again, it showed the relevance of T20 in discussing and presenting ideas designed to address many of the regional and global problems G20 members and other countries face. Adding a little reflection on today's task force presentations, we know that trade, investment, and a performant financial architecture are crucial elements in a sustainable development framework. As mentioned yesterday, the work carried out by G20 and T20 goes much beyond those two groups. The fresh ideas about public policies, formulation, and implementation may eventually help to change the world, beginning with multilateral institutions and global governance. In this matter, T20 contribution lies in elaborating strong, feasible, relevant, and precise recommendations that help raise public policy quality, as underscored by Ambassador Márcio Loureiro today. There are two extra remarks regarding today's sessions in a sort of wrap-up, closing remarks and highlights I noted here. The first one, Task Forces 4 and 3 presented the priorities of their topics and subtopics, emphasizing the importance of thinking outside the box with fresh suggestions and solutions for long-standing issues regarding trade and investment and reforms of the international financial architecture. These issues have faced challenges in being addressed by the current global governance structure. Suggestions raised during the discussion included the need for developing a model to advance international structural reforms and to enhance access to international funds. The second remark is that Ambassador Karamuru interviewed Ambassador Tatiana Rosito, Secretary of Financial Affairs at the Ministry of Finance of Brazil and coordinator of the G20 Brasil Finance Track, regarding the current structure of the international finance agenda and Brazil's presidency priorities in this agenda. And the priorities are addressing the debts of developing countries, financing for development and transitioning to a low carbon economy, and the securitization of the international trade agenda, which in a certain way makes more complex the promotion of sustainable development, but that's a challenge that has to be faced. Saying that, I thank all panelists and moderators for this successful second day of the T20 Brasil Inception Conference. I especially thank all participants in countries much ahead of or behind the Brazilian hour for their support and resilience. It's a privilege to count on you among our audience. I hope seeing you on our Inception Conference third day and last day tomorrow. I also thank the leaders and staff of IPEA, FUNAG, and SEBRE involved in this second day of T20 Brasil Inception Conference. But before we close the sessions, two announcements. The first one, remember that tomorrow, for the last day of our Inception Conference, we will be using the same link. And second, now I invite you to open your camera for our traditional family photo.